The wind that morning carried the smell of ash and regret. Mara Ellison stood in the parlor of her family's decaying house, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. The wallpaper, once cream and dignified, peeled in long, melancholy strips. The furniture had been sold off piece by piece over the years, leaving only the skeleton of what had once been a respectable home. Now there was nothing left to sell. Nothing except her. Her father sat slumped in the only remaining chair, a man carved hollow by drink and bad decisions. His hands trembled as he held the glass of whiskey that had become his constant companion. Across from him stood her brother Raymond, lean, sharp-featured, and cold as the January wind. Raymond had always been efficient with cruelty. He wore it like a well-tailored suit. "It's done," Raymond said flatly, pulling a folded paper from his coat pocket. "Voss agreed to the terms, $50 cash, and he takes her off our hands by week's end." Mara's stomach turned to ice. She'd known this was coming, had felt it circling for months like a vulture, but hearing the words spoken aloud made it real, made it final. $50, her father mumbled, not looking up. "For my daughter." "For your debt," Raymond corrected sharply, "which, in case you've forgotten, stands at nearly 200. Voss was the only man willing to consider the arrangement. You should be grateful." Grateful. The word tasted like poison. Mara had been 19 when her mother died, 20 when her father's drinking became a profession rather than a pastime, 22 when the creditors started coming around with increasing frequency and decreasing patience. Now, at 24, she stood in a gutted house being bartered like livestock. She'd once had dreams, books and learning, a teaching position perhaps, or work in one of the city offices back east. Her mother had taught her to read before she could walk, had filled her head with poetry and possibility. But dreams required money, and money was the one thing the Ellisons no longer possessed. "When?" Mara heard herself ask. Her voice sounded distant, as if it belonged to someone else. Raymond glanced at her with something between pity and impatience. 3 days, Saturday morning. Reverend Cole will perform the ceremony at Voss's property." "His property?" Mara's laugh was sharp and bitter. "Of course, can't have the transaction take place anywhere civilized." "Mara," her father started, but she cut him off with a look that could freeze blood. "Don't," she said quietly. "Don't pretend this is anything other than what it is." She turned and climbed the narrow stairs to her room, the last private space she would ever call her own. The floorboards creaked under her weight, a familiar sound that now felt like a countdown. 3 days, 72 hours until she became the property of a man she'd never met. Calder Voss. The name itself was spoken in town with a particular tone, not quite fear, not quite pity, but something uncomfortably close to both. He owned a ranch 15 miles north of town, carved into the brutal landscape at the base of the Iron Ridge Mountains. People said he'd been out there for nearly 20 years, living alone, speaking to no one unless absolutely necessary. Some called him simple. Others said he was mean. The general consensus was that he was broken in some fundamental way, a man best left alone. And now he'd purchased a wife. Mara sat on the edge of her narrow bed and stared at her hands. They were rougher than they'd once been, marked by years of household work and survival. But they were steady. That was something, at least. Whatever was coming, she would face it with her eyes open and her spine straight. She would not break. The door creaked open and Raymond stepped inside without knocking. Privacy had become another luxury they could no longer afford. "I know what you're thinking," he said, leaning against the doorframe. "I doubt that. You're thinking this is unfair, that you deserve better." His voice was matter-of-fact, almost gentle. That made it worse. "Maybe you're right. But fair doesn't put food on the table, Mara. Fair doesn't keep the bank from seizing what's left of this property. You could get a job," she said coldly. "You could work instead of managing father's debts like some kind of vulture accountant." Something flickered across Raymond's face, anger, maybe, or guilt, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. "Voss isn't a bad man. Strange, yes, quiet, but not cruel. You could do worse." "Could I?" Mara stood, facing him directly. "Could I really do worse than being sold to a stranger like a piece of furniture?" Raymond's jaw tightened. "You think you're special because Mother taught you to read? Because you've got ideas above your station? He stepped closer, his voice dropping. You're 24 years old, unmarried, with no prospects and no dowry. In another year, you'd be considered a charity case. This way, at least you'll have a roof over your head and a name that isn't Ellison. The words landed like blows, precise and calculated. Raymond had always known exactly where to strike. Get out, Mara whispered. He studied her for a moment longer, then nodded and left, closing the door behind him with a soft click that sounded like a prison gate locking. Mara stood alone in the gathering darkness, listening to the wind howl against the house. In 3 days, she would belong to Calder Voss. In 3 days, her life as she knew it would end. She walked to the small mirror above her washstand and studied her reflection. Brown hair, brown eyes, a face that was neither beautiful nor plain, just ordinary, forgettable. The kind of face that disappeared in crowds. But there was something else there too, something Raymond hadn't managed to kill. A stubborn spark of defiance, a refusal to be extinguished. You will survive this, she told her reflection. Whatever comes, you will survive. What? Saturday morning arrived with brutal cold and clear skies. Mara woke before dawn, packed her few belongings into a single worn carpet bag, and dressed in the only good dress she still owned, a dark blue wool that had belonged to her mother. It smelled faintly of lavender and loss. No one came to help her prepare. No female relatives to fuss over her hair or offer hollow encouragements. Just the empty house and the sound of her father's snoring from the room below. Raymond appeared at 7 o'clock sharp, driving a borrowed wagon. He'd attempted to make himself presentable. His coat was brushed, his hair combed, but there was no warmth in his eyes. This was business. Just business. Ready? He asked. Mara climbed into the wagon without answering. The ride north was silent except for the crunch of frozen ground beneath the wheels. The landscape grew increasingly desolate as they climbed toward the mountains. Bare trees, rocky soil, endless stretches of emptiness punctuated by the occasional ranch house hunched against the wind. After nearly 2 hours, Raymond pulled the wagon onto a narrow track that wound through a stand of pines. Almost there, he said, the first words he'd spoken since they left town. Mara's heart hammered against her ribs. She wanted to ask what he knew about Voss, what she should expect, but pride kept her silent. Raymond had already made it clear what he thought of her questions. The trees opened into a clearing, and Mara got her first look at what would be her new home. It was not what she'd expected. The main house was small but solid, rough-hewn logs chinked with clay, a stone chimney rising from one end, windows that actually had glass. Not wealthy, but not poverty either. A large barn stood 50 yards away, its red paint faded but intact. She could see a chicken coop, a root cellar, split-rail fencing marking off pastures where a handful of cattle grazed. It looked like a working ranch, like someone actually lived here and cared for it. A man emerged from the barn, and Mara's breath caught. Calder Voss was not what she'd expected either. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders and the kind of build that came from years of hard physical labor. His hair was dark, almost black, and hung past his collar in a way that suggested he cut it himself when he remembered. He wore work clothes, canvas pants, and a heavy wool shirt, both clean but worn. But it was his face that stopped her. He was younger than she'd assumed, perhaps 35 at most, and there was nothing simple or mean about his features. Strong jaw, straight nose, eyes that were startling in their intensity even from a distance. What struck her most was the exhaustion carved into every line. He looked like a man who hadn't slept properly in years. Calder stopped walking when he saw the wagon. For a long moment, he simply stood there, his expression unreadable. Raymond climbed down and gestured for Mara to follow. Her legs felt unsteady as her feet hit the frozen ground. "Vas, Ba," Raymond called out, his voice taking on an artificially jovial tone. Right on time. "This is Mara, as agreed." Calder's gaze moved to her, and Mara found herself unable to look away. His eyes were gray, the color of winter storms, and completely unguarded in that first moment. She saw pain there, and wariness, and something else she couldn't quite name. Then he blinked, and whatever she'd glimpsed vanished behind a wall of careful neutrality. "Reverend's inside," Calder said. His voice was rough from disuse, each word seeming to cost him effort. Excellent. Raymond pulled a folded document from his pocket, the marriage contract, and held it out. Everything's in order. Things in. Once the ceremony's complete and you sign, she's legally yours. The debt is cleared and we're square. Mara's hands clenched into fists at her sides. She's legally yours, as if she were a horse or a plow. Calder took the paper without comment and turned toward the house. Raymond shot Mara a warning look, behave, then followed. Mara had no choice but to trail behind them both. The interior of the house was warm, heated by a fire crackling in the stone hearth. The main room served as kitchen and living space, simple furniture, everything functional rather than decorative. Clean, she noted, almost obsessively so. Books lined a shelf near the window, their spines cracked from reading. Reverend Cole stood waiting, a thin man with kind eyes and hands that shook slightly. He was old, likely making this journey as a favor to Voss rather than any real desire to perform the ceremony. "Shall we begin?" Cole asked gently. What followed was the shortest marriage ceremony Mara had ever witnessed. No music, no flowers, no gathered friends or family. Just words spoken in a quiet room while the fire popped and hissed. "Do you, Calder Voss, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" "I do." The words were barely above a whisper. "And do you, Mara Ellison, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Mara's throat was dry. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to fight, to refuse, but there was nowhere to run to, no one to fight for her. And refusal meant returning to her father's house to watch him drink himself to death, while Raymond sold off everything including her dignity. "I do," she said, and felt the door close on her old life. Reverend Cole produced a worn Bible and had them both sign the marriage register. Raymond signed as witness, adding his sharp, efficient signature with obvious relief. The debt was paid. The burden was lifted. His sister was no longer his problem. Money changed hands. Mara refused to watch that part. And then Raymond was shaking Calder's hand, thanking him with false warmth, and heading for the door. "Raymond," Mara called out, hating the tremor in her voice. He paused, hand on the doorframe, but didn't turn around. "I'll never forgive you for this." His shoulders tensed. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I know." Then he was gone, and Mara was alone with her husband. Reverend Cole gathered his things with apologetic efficiency. "I'll see myself out," he murmured. "Blessings to you both." The door closed behind him with a soft thud. Silence filled the space, heavy and awkward and suffocating. Mara stood rigidly near the hearth, her carpetbag still clutched in one hand. Calder remained by the door, his face angled away from her. "There's a room," he finally said, gesturing toward a doorway on the far side of the main room. "For you. I'll sleep in the barn." Mara blinked in surprise. Whatever she'd been expecting, it wasn't that. "You don't have to," she started, but he cut her off. "I do." His hand moved unconsciously to his temple, fingers pressing against the side of his head in what looked like an old habit. "You'll want privacy, space. I won't bother you." The last words came out strained, as if speaking itself caused physical pain. Mara studied him carefully. Up close, the exhaustion was even more pronounced. Dark circles under his eyes, a tightness around his mouth that spoke of constant discomfort. His right hand trembled slightly when he lowered it from his head. "Are you all right?" she asked before she could stop herself. Calder's jaw clenched. "Fine." "You don't look fine." His gaze snapped to her, sharp and defensive. For a moment she thought he might snap at her, order her to mind her own business or worse. But then something in his expression crumbled, just slightly. "Headaches," he said shortly. "I get headaches. They'll pass." But they didn't sound like the kind of headaches that passed. They sounded like the kind that stayed and never left. "How long have you had them?" "Long enough." He moved past her toward the door, clearly ending the conversation. "Food's in the root cellar. Help yourself to whatever. I've got work to do." "Wait," Mara called out, but he was already gone, the door closing firmly behind him. She stood alone in the house that was now supposed to be her home, married to a stranger who could barely stand to be in the same room with her, and felt the weight of her new reality settle onto her shoulders like a physical thing. This was her life now. This cold, silent isolation. This transaction disguised as marriage. Mara set her carpetbag down and removed her coat with mechanical precision. Then she walked to the room Calder had indicated, a small space with a bed, a dresser, and a window that looked out toward the mountains, and sat down on the edge of the mattress. She did not cry. Tears were a luxury she could no longer afford. Instead, she took a long, steady breath and began making mental notes. The house was clean but basic. There were gaps in the chinking that would need repair before deep winter arrived. The kitchen area was functional but poorly organized. The books on the shelf suggested education, maybe even culture, but they were covered in dust. Calder Voss was a puzzle. A man who clearly valued solitude, yet purchased a wife. A man who kept a clean, well-maintained home, but looked like he hadn't slept in years. A man who promised not to bother her, as if his very presence was an imposition. And those headaches, the way his hand had moved to his temple, the strain in his voice. That wasn't normal pain. That was something chronic, something debilitating. Mara rose and walked to the window, looking out at the barn where Calder had disappeared. Smoke rose from the chimney. He was likely working near the small forge she'd glimpsed earlier. She was stuck here. That was the reality. But stuck didn't have to mean helpless. She'd survived poverty and loss and her family's slow collapse. She could survive this too. And maybe, just maybe, she could figure out what was really wrong with Calder Voss. Odd. The first week passed in careful, distant routine. Mara woke before dawn, started the fire, and made breakfast. Calder would appear from the barn, eat in silence, and disappear again. Lunch was the same. Dinner was a slightly longer affair, but no less quiet. He never looked directly at her if he could help it, never initiated conversation, never intruded on her space. At night, she could see the lamp burning in the barn until late hours, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, sometimes almost dawn. He wasn't sleeping, or couldn't sleep, or was in too much pain to sleep. She began to notice patterns. Every 3 or 4 days, Calder would disappear for hours, returning pale and shaking, barely able to walk. He'd go straight to the barn and wouldn't emerge until the next morning. On those days, she could hear sounds, low, agonized groans that made her stomach twist. The headaches weren't just headaches. They were something worse. Mara tried to approach the subject carefully. "Is there a doctor in town?" she asked one morning over breakfast. Calder's fork paused halfway to his mouth. "Why?" "I was just wondering, if someone got sick or injured." "There's a doctor." He resumed eating. "Why?" "No reason, just getting my bearings." His eyes narrowed slightly, but he didn't push. They finished breakfast in their usual silence. That afternoon, Mara made her first trip to town. Calder had given her permission to take the wagon and get whatever supplies she needed, pressing money into her hand with obvious discomfort. She'd tried to refuse. She didn't want his charity, but he'd insisted. "You're managing the house now," he'd said quietly. "You need supplies. Take what you need." The ride to town gave her time to think. The landscape was harsh but beautiful in its way, all sharp edges and brutal honesty. No pretense, no false comfort, just survival on its own terms. The town itself was small. One main street with a general store, a saloon, a church, and a handful of other businesses clustered together like frightened sheep. People turned to stare as she drove past. News of Calder Voss's marriage had clearly made the rounds. She could feel their judgment like a physical weight. Poor girl. Sold to that strange man on the mountain. Wonder how long she'll last. Mara held her head high and walked into the general store with as much dignity as she could muster. The proprietor, a heavy-set woman named Mrs. Brennan, looked her up and down with poorly concealed curiosity. "You must be the new Mrs. Voss." "I am." Mara set her basket on the counter. "I need flour, sugar, salt, and lamp oil." Mrs. Brennan moved with deliberate slowness, gathering the items one by one. "How are you finding ranch life?" "It's an adjustment." "I imagine so." The woman's tone was laden with false sympathy. "Calder Voss isn't exactly, Well, he's not what you'd call sociable, is he? Mara met her gaze directly. He's been perfectly civil. Civil, Mrs. Brennan chuckled. That's one word for it, though I suppose you'd know better than most now. Must be quite a change from town life. The implication was clear. You've fallen so far, from respectable family to wife of the mountain hermit. Mara placed coins on the counter with precise movements. Thank you for the supplies. She loaded the wagon and was about to leave when she noticed a small building at the end of the street, a doctor's office according to the weathered sign. After a moment's hesitation, she tied off the wagon and walked over. The office was cramped and cluttered, smelling of carbolic and old paper. A man in his 50s looked up from behind a desk piled high with medical journals. Help you? He asked, not unkindly. Are you the doctor? Dr. Holloway. And you are? Mara Voss. The name still felt strange in her mouth. I wanted to ask about headaches. Holloway's eyebrows rose. Headaches? You having troubles? Not me. She hesitated. Someone I know. Severe headaches. Chronic. They seem to come in waves lasting hours. The person can barely function when they hit. The doctor leaned back in his chair, considering. Could be any number of things. Migraines, tension headaches, cluster headaches, eye strain, if they're doing close work. Without examining the patient, it's hard to say. What if it's been going on for years? Years? Holloway frowned. That's unusual. At that point, you're looking at either something structural, a growth maybe, or nerve damage, or something behavioral. Some folks hurt so long they forget what it's like not to hurt. And if there were other symptoms? Dizziness, maybe? Problems with balance or hearing? The doctor's expression grew more serious. Then I'd want to see that person immediately. Those symptoms together could indicate something serious. Pressure on the brain, fluid buildup, infection. And if the person refused to see a doctor? Then they're a fool. Holloway's voice was blunt. Whatever it is won't get better on its own. If anything, it'll get worse. Mara thanked him and left, her mind churning. Something structural. Pressure on the brain. Infection. Whatever was wrong with Calder, it was more than just headaches. And he'd been living with it for years, suffering alone, telling no one, seeking no help. Why? She drove back to the ranch as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the frozen ground. Calder was working near the barn, splitting wood with mechanical efficiency. Even from a distance, she could see the tension in his movements, the way he favored his right side. Mara pulled the wagon to a stop and began unloading supplies. Calder appeared beside her, wordlessly taking the heavier items. His face was gray with fatigue and pain. You don't have to help, she said. Neither do you. It was the first remotely conversational exchange they'd had in days. Calder, she said carefully, when was the last time you saw a doctor? His entire body went rigid. Why are you asking? Because you're in pain. Anyone with eyes can see it. It's nothing. It's not nothing. It's, leave it alone, Mara. His voice was sharp, final. He grabbed the last of the supplies and stalked toward the house. She followed, frustration building. I'm just trying to help. I didn't ask for your help. No, you asked for a wife, and now you have one. So either let me actually be useful, or tell me what the hell I'm supposed to do here besides sit in silence and watch you suffer. The words burst out before she could stop them, echoing across the clearing. Calder stopped walking. His shoulders rose and fell with heavy breaths. When he finally turned to face her, his expression was raw and unguarded. You want to be useful? He said, voice rough. Then just exist. Cook if you want. Keep the house if it matters to you. Read the books on the shelf. Write letters to anyone who'll still receive them. I don't care. But don't try to fix me because I'm not fixable. Everyone's fixable. Not me. He moved closer, and she could see the pain etched into every line of his face. I've lived with this for 20 years. I've seen doctors. I've tried every remedy, every medicine, every damn thing anyone suggested. Nothing works. Nothing helps. So I learned to live with it, and I got on with my life as best I could. Alone. That's how it is. That's how it has to be. Then why did you marry me? Mara demanded. If you want to be alone so badly, why go through with this? Calder's jaw worked for a moment, as if he was physically chewing on the words before he could spit them out. Because the bank was going to take the ranch. Because I needed someone to help run it while I'm not able. Because your brother made a convincing case that you were practical and wouldn't ask questions and would just manage things. The truth landed like a slap. She'd known this was a transaction, but hearing it stated so baldly still stung. I see, she said quietly. No, you don't. Calder dragged a hand through his hair, looking suddenly exhausted. You think I wanted this? You think I wanted to drag someone into this mess? I tried everything else first. But the ranch, this place, it's all I have. And I was losing it. So you bought me. I married you. His voice dropped. There's a difference. You're not a servant, Mara. You're not chattel. You're here. And I know that's not much. I know this isn't what you wanted, but it's what we have. He turned and walked into the house, leaving her standing in the growing darkness. Mara stood there for a long moment, feeling the cold seep through her coat. Then she picked up the remaining supplies and followed him inside. They ate dinner in tense silence. Calder excused himself early, heading back to the barn with barely a word. Mara cleaned up, banked the fire, and went to her room. But she didn't sleep. Instead, she lay in the darkness and thought about everything she'd learned. Calder had been suffering for 20 years. He'd tried doctors. He'd tried everything. But had he really tried everything? A thought began to form, dangerous and half-formed but persistent. What if the answer wasn't something a doctor could see? What if it was something simpler, something overlooked? She thought about the way Calder's hand always went to his right temple, the way he tilted his head when he was listening, as if trying to hear better from one side, the way his balance sometimes wavered, all on the right side. Mara rose and lit her lamp, moving quietly to the small shelf where Calder kept his books. She ran her fingers along the spines until she found what she was looking for, a medical reference book, old but comprehensive. She carried it back to her room and began to read. Hours passed. The lamp burned low. Outside she could hear the wind picking up, rattling the shutters. And slowly, impossibly, a theory began to take shape. What if Calder Voss wasn't sick at all? What if he was infested? The idea was absurd, impossible, the kind of thing that belonged in Gothic novels, not real life. But Mara couldn't shake it. She'd read accounts in the medical book, rare cases, mostly from tropical regions or areas with poor sanitation, parasites that entered through the ear canal, worms that burrowed into soft tissue and stayed there, feeding and growing, sometimes for years. The symptoms matched: chronic headaches localized to one side, gradual hearing loss, balance problems, pain that came in waves as the parasite moved or grew. It was rare, incredibly rare, but not impossible. The question was, how could she possibly confirm it? And even if she was right, what could she do? Mara spent the next 2 days observing Calder with new eyes. She watched the way he moved, the way he reacted to sounds, the way his pain seemed to intensify in patterns. On the third day, she saw her opportunity. Calder was working in the barn, repairing harness leather. She approached carefully, carrying a cup of coffee as an excuse. "Thought you might want this," she said. He looked up, surprise flickering across his face. "Thanks." She set the cup down nearby and leaned against a post, trying to appear casual. "Can I ask you something?" His guard went up immediately. "Depends on the question." "The pain. Is it always on the right side?" Calder's hand stilled on the leather. "Mostly. Why?" "And your hearing, is it worse on that side too?" His jaw clenched. "I said leave it alone, Mara." "I know what you said. I'm asking anyway." They stared at each other for a long moment. Then, surprisingly, Calder sighed and set down his tools. "Yes," he said quietly. "The right side. The pain, the hearing, all of it. Has been for as long as I can remember." "Since you were a child?" "Since I was about 15. His voice was distant, remembering. "Woke up one morning with a ringing in my ear. Thought it was just an earache, but it never went away. Got worse over the years. The ringing turned to pain. The pain turned to, this." "Did anyone ever look in your ear?" Actually look? Calder's laugh was bitter. Doctors looked. Said there was nothing there. Said it was in my head. Which, technically, I suppose it is. But did they really look? Or did they just glance and assume? He studied her with those storm-gray eyes. What are you getting at? Mara took a breath. This was the moment. Either he'd think she was insane or he'd listen. I think there might be something in your ear canal, something physical, a blockage, or… She hesitated. Or something else. Like what? I don't know, but if I'm right, it would explain everything, the pain, the hearing loss, the pattern of symptoms. And it would mean you're not just suffering for no reason. There's a cause. And causes can be treated. Calder stared at her like she'd grown a second head. You think there's something in my ear? I think it's possible. Mara, I've had doctors, real doctors, trained professionals, examine me. If there was something there, they would have found it. Would they? She moved closer. Or would they have looked for what they expected to find, and when they didn't see it, assumed there was nothing? How hard did they really look? She could see him wavering, caught between hope and the learned certainty that hope was dangerous. Even if you're right, he said slowly, even if there is something, what then? What would you suggest? Surgery? I can't afford that. And even if I could, the nearest surgical hospital is 3 days away. I'd never survive the journey when the pain hits. Let me look, Mara said simply. What? Let me look in your ear, really look. If I'm wrong, fine. We never speak of it again, but if I'm right… She met his gaze directly. If I'm right, maybe we can do something about it. You're not a doctor. No, but I can see and I can think, and I'm already here. She softened her voice. What do you have to lose, Calder? The question hung between them. What did he have to lose? His dignity? He'd already sold that when he married a woman half his payment for a debt. His pride? That had died years ago under the weight of constant pain. His hope? He'd buried that so deep he'd forgotten what it looked like. All right, he said finally. Look, but when you find nothing, you drop this. Agreed? Agreed. They went into the house. Mara positioned Calder near the window where the afternoon light was strongest. Her hands shook slightly as she gathered what she needed. A lamp, clean water. A small mirror she could angle to reflect light. Tilt your head, she instructed. Right ear toward the light. Calder obeyed, his body tense with discomfort and skepticism. Mara leaned close, using the mirror to direct light into his ear canal. At first, she saw nothing unusual, just the normal curves and shadows of the inner ear. She adjusted the angle, moved the lamp, tried again. Still nothing. Her certainty began to waver. Maybe she was wrong. Maybe she'd built an entire theory on nothing but desperation and wishful thinking. Then the light caught something. Deep in the canal, barely visible, there was a shadow that didn't move with the light. Something that shouldn't be there. Mara's breath caught. What? Calder asked, hearing her reaction. What is it? Don't move. Her voice was steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. There's something there. I can see it. See what? I don't know yet. Something dark. Could be a blockage. Could be… She trailed off, not wanting to say it aloud until she was sure. She needed better tools, something to actually reach whatever it was. Stay there, she ordered, then rushed to the kitchen. She found a clean cloth, alcohol from the medical supplies, a pair of tweezers. Her mind raced. If this was what she thought it was, she'd have to be incredibly careful. One wrong move could push it deeper or cause serious damage. But if she did nothing, Calder would continue suffering for the rest of his life. The choice was clear. She returned to find Calder exactly where she'd left him, his expression caught between fear and desperate hope. I'm going to try to remove it, she said. It's going to hurt. Maybe a lot. If at any point it becomes unbearable, tell me and I'll stop. Understood? Will it make things worse? I don't think so, but I can't promise anything. Calder closed his eyes. Do it. Mara sterilized the tweezers with alcohol, said a silent prayer to whoever might be listening, and positioned herself. The first attempt failed. Whatever it was lodged too deep for the tweezers to reach. She tried again, angling differently. Calder's breathing grew ragged. His hands clenched into fists. "I'm sorry," she murmured. "I'm so sorry." "Don't stop," he gritted out. "Don't you dare stop." On the third attempt, she felt the tweezers catch something. She pulled, gently, steadily, her own breath held. The thing moved. Calder made a sound low in his throat, pain and shock combined. Mara kept pulling, slow and careful, as something dark and impossibly alive emerged from his ear canal. It was a worm, thick as a pencil lead, perhaps an inch long, writhing weakly in the light. It had been living inside Calder's head for 2 decades, feeding on tissue, causing agony with every movement. Mara dropped it into a cup of alcohol and watched it die. Then she looked at Calder, who was staring at the cup with an expression of absolute horror and dawning relief. "You were right," he whispered. "You were right." And for the first time since they'd met, Calder Voss began to weep. The silence that followed was unlike any silence before it. Calder sat with his head in his hands, shoulders shaking, while Mara stood frozen with the tweezers still gripped in her trembling fingers. The cup of alcohol on the table held the dead parasite, evidence of 20 years of suffering that should never have been, proof that sometimes the answer to impossible pain was horrifyingly simple. "I can hear," Calder finally whispered. His voice was raw, broken by emotion. "The ringing. It's gone. I can actually hear." Mara set down the tweezers with careful precision, her own hand shaking so badly she nearly knocked over the lamp. The magnitude of what had just happened was beginning to sink in. She'd performed an extraction with no training, no supervision, nothing but instinct and desperation. She could have killed him, could have pushed that thing deeper into his brain, could have caused an infection that would have ended everything. But she hadn't. "We need to clean the area," she said, forcing herself into practical mode before the terror could catch up with her. "Make sure there's no infection starting." Calder nodded mutely and let her work. She flushed his ear canal with warm water and alcohol, her movements gentle despite the adrenaline still coursing through her system. He flinched at the sting but didn't pull away. "Does it still hurt?" she asked. "Yes, but it's different." He paused, searching for words. "It's like surface pain now. Not that deep, crushing thing, just soreness. Like a wound healing instead of a wound rotting." Mara felt something crack open in her chest, relief so profound it was almost painful. "That's good. That's exactly what we want." She finished cleaning and bandaged his ear with a clean cloth, then stepped back. Calder slowly raised his head and looked at her. His face was still wet with tears, his eyes red-rimmed, but there was something new there. Something that hadn't existed before. Recognition. Real recognition. As if he was truly seeing her for the first time. "Why did you do this?" he asked quietly. "Because no one else would." "You could have hurt me. Made things worse." "I could have." Mara met his gaze steadily. "But doing nothing was also a choice. And doing nothing meant watching you suffer for the rest of your life when there might be something that could help." Calder stood slowly, testing his balance. He swayed slightly, then steadied himself against the table. "Everything sounds different, clearer, like someone turned up the volume on the whole world. Your hearing was compensating for the damage. It'll take time to adjust." He walked to the window and stood there, looking out at the ranch he'd nearly lost, the land he'd suffered for. When he spoke again, his voice was thick with emotion he wasn't bothering to hide. "I thought I was going to die like this. In pain. Alone. I'd made my peace with it." "You don't have to die like anything," Mara said. "You're 35 years old. You have time." "I feel like I've been given my life back." He turned to face her, and the raw gratitude in his expression was almost too much to witness. "You gave me my life back." Mara didn't know how to respond to that. She'd spent weeks being treated like an obligation, a burden taken on to save a failing ranch. And now this man was looking at her like she'd performed a miracle. "I just looked," she said quietly. "That's all. I just actually looked." "No one else did." Calder moved away from the window, closer to her. 20 years, dozens of doctors, and no one looked the way you did." "They didn't have reason to. You were just another patient with chronic pain, easy to dismiss. And you? What made you different? Mara considered the question. What had made her look when no one else did? Was it compassion? Stubbornness? The desperate need to be useful in a situation where she had no control? I had time, she finally said, and I had nothing to lose. If I was wrong, you'd just think I was foolish. But if I was right, you were right. Calder's hand moved unconsciously toward his bandaged ear, then stopped. How did you know? How did you figure it out? Medical book from your shelf, observation, and honestly, a lot of guessing. She managed a weak smile. I'm not a doctor, Calder. I got lucky. Incredibly, impossibly lucky. Lucky. He laughed, the sound ragged but genuine. If that's luck, I'll take it. The afternoon stretched into evening. Calder tried to help with chores, but Mara insisted he rest. For once, he didn't argue. He settled into the chair by the fire, his hand occasionally touching the bandage as if to confirm it was real. Mara prepared dinner, venison stew and bread, while watching him from the corner of her eye. The change was already visible. His shoulders had lost some of their constant tension. His breathing was deeper, more relaxed. Even the lines around his eyes seemed less pronounced. How bad is the pain now? She asked as she served the food. Maybe 3 out of 10. 4 when I move my jaw. He took a spoonful of stew and paused, his expression shifting to surprise. This is good. You sound shocked. I am. I've been eating my own cooking for 20 years. He took another bite. This is really good. They ate in companionable silence, different from the tense, awkward silences of before. This one felt earned, shared. I need to go to town tomorrow, Mara said eventually. Show that thing to Dr. Holloway. Calder's hand tightened on his spoon. Why? Because he needs to see it, needs to document it. This is medical evidence, Calder. This proves what was wrong with you, and more importantly, it proves that it can be treated. I don't want you... He stopped, jaw clenched. I don't want to be examined like some kind of curiosity. You won't be. But imagine if this happens to someone else. Imagine if there's another person out there suffering the way you did, and doctors keep dismissing them because they've never seen evidence that this is real. She leaned forward. You can help them, just by letting one doctor see what was done. Calder stared at his bowl for a long moment. Fine, but you're coming with me. I'm not facing Holloway alone. I wouldn't let you. That night, Calder made his way to the barn as usual, but Mara called out to stop him. You don't have to sleep out there anymore. He turned, silhouetted in the doorway. The arrangement was made by a man in constant pain who could barely function. That man doesn't exist anymore. She kept her voice gentle but firm. There's a perfectly good second room upstairs. Take it. Use it. You've earned the right to sleep in your own house. For a moment she thought he might argue, but then he nodded slowly and headed for the stairs instead of the door. Mara listened to his footsteps overhead, the creak of floorboards, the sound of a window opening, then closing, then silence. She banked the fire and went to her own room, utterly exhausted. The events of the day crashed over her in waves. She'd extracted a living parasite from a man's ear canal. She'd risked his life based on nothing but a theory and determination. She'd succeeded against all odds, and now everything was different. Sleep claimed her quickly, deep and dreamless. She woke to the smell of coffee. Mara sat up, disoriented. Dawn light filtered through her window, later than she usually slept, and someone was moving around in the kitchen. She dressed quickly and emerged to find Calder at the stove, frying eggs with the awkward concentration of someone attempting a skill they'd neglected. He looked up when she entered, and the difference in his face was startling in the morning light. The exhaustion was still there. You didn't erase 20 years of sleep deprivation overnight, but the constant grinding tension was gone. He looked younger, almost boyish. Morning, he said. His voice was less rough, easier. Figured I owed you breakfast. Fair warning, my cooking skills are limited. I can see that. Mara eyed the slightly burnt eggs with amusement. But I appreciate the effort. They ate together, and Calder talked more in that single meal than he had in all the previous weeks combined. He told her about the ranch, how he'd bought it with money saved from working as a ranch hand, how he'd built most of the structures himself, how he'd nearly lost it a dozen times before this latest crisis. The headaches made everything harder, he admitted. Some days I couldn't work at all, just had to wait them out. The cattle suffered for it. The land suffered. I couldn't keep hired help because they'd see me during a bad spell and think I was drunk or mad. So you stopped trying to hire anyone. Seemed easier that way. Couldn't disappoint people if they weren't around to begin with. He paused, his coffee cup halfway to his mouth. Until I ran out of options. And bought a wife. And married a woman who turned out to be far more capable than anyone gave her credit for. He met her eyes. Including me. I'm sorry for that. For underestimating you. Mara didn't know what to say. An apology from Calder Voss felt as rare and precious as gold. We should go to town, she said instead, before I lose my nerve. Dr. Holloway's office was quiet when they arrived mid-morning. The doctor looked up from his desk, his expression shifting to surprise when he recognized Mara, and then to deeper surprise when he saw she wasn't alone. Mrs. Voss, and you must be Calder. Holloway stood, his professional demeanor sliding into place. What brings you both in? Mara set the sealed jar on his desk. Inside, preserved in alcohol, was the parasite. I believe this is what was causing my husband's headaches. Holloway picked up the jar slowly, holding it to the light. His expression cycled through disbelief, shock, and dawning horror. Where did you get this? From his ear canal, yesterday afternoon. The doctor's gaze snapped to Calder. You're telling me this was inside your head? For 20 years, apparently, Calder said quietly. And you? Holloway turned to Mara. You extracted it yourself? No one else was going to. The doctor sank into his chair, still staring at the specimen. I've read about these, parasitic worms that enter through the ear canal, but I've never seen one, never even met anyone who claimed to have one. He looked at Calder with something approaching awe. You've been living with this for 2 decades? Didn't have much choice. And the symptoms? The headaches? Gone, or at least mostly gone. There's residual pain, but it's manageable. Nothing like before. Holloway spent the next 30 minutes examining Calder, asking questions, taking notes with the fervor of a man witnessing medical history. He inspected the extraction site, marveling at the clean removal, the minimal damage. You did this without any surgical training? He asked Mara. I did it because it needed doing. You could have killed him. One wrong move and that thing could have burrowed deeper, caused sepsis, brain damage, death. I'm aware. And yet you did it anyway. Yes. Holloway sat back, shaking his head in wonder. Mrs. Voss, what you've accomplished here is remarkable, unprecedented. This will need to be documented, published even. The medical community needs to know that these cases exist and can be treated. Mara felt her stomach tighten. I don't want notoriety. I just want my husband to be well. I understand, but think of the others who might be suffering the same way. If we publish this case, anonymously, if you prefer, it could help doctors recognize these symptoms in the future. Could save lives. Calder's hand found Mara's under the table, his fingers closing around hers. It was the first time they'd touched deliberately, consciously. His palm was calloused and warm. Do it, he said quietly. Publish it. If it helps even one person, it's worth it. They left the doctor's office an hour later with a promise that Holloway would write up the case for a medical journal. The jar stayed with him, evidence that would hopefully change how frontier doctors approach chronic pain. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, but it was a comfortable silence. Calder drove with one hand, the other resting between them on the wagon seat. Not touching, but close. A possibility. Thank you, he said as they crested the hill that gave view to the ranch. For believing me when no one else did. You don't need to keep thanking me. I think I do. He pulled the wagon to a stop, looking out over his land. I was ready to die, Mara. Had convinced myself it was just a matter of time, and then you came along and refused to let me give up. I'm stubborn that way. I'm starting to see that. His expression softened. I know this isn't what you wanted, this marriage, this life, but I'm glad you're here. More than I can say. Mara felt something shift in her chest, a wall she'd built beginning to crack. I'm glad too. Surprisingly, they resumed the journey home, and for the first time since arriving at the ranch, Mara felt like she actually belonged there. The next few days passed in a kind of honeymoon period, not romantic, but hopeful. Calder's hearing continued to improve. The pain subsided to occasional twinges. He slept through the night for the first time in decades and woke looking like a different person. He worked the ranch with renewed energy, fixing things that had been neglected during his worst periods. Mara helped where she could, learning the rhythm of ranch life, the careful dance of chores that kept everything running. They talked more, cautiously at first, then with increasing ease. Calder told her about his childhood, growing up on a different ranch, losing his parents young, making his own way. Mara told him about her mother's death, her father's decline, the slow erosion of everything she'd once believed her life would be. "I thought I'd be a teacher," she admitted one evening as they sat by the fire. Had it all planned out? Would teach in town, save money, maybe travel, see something beyond frozen fields and desperate people. "You still could." "Could I?" She smiled without humor. "I'm a married woman now. My place is here." "Your place is wherever you want it to be." Calder's voice was serious. "I won't trap you, Mara. If you want to leave, pursue that dream, I won't stop you." She studied him in the firelight. "And what would you do?" "Manage, somehow, like I did before." "That's not managing, that's surviving. There's a difference." "Maybe." He poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling upward. "But I'd rather you be happy somewhere else than miserable here." The words settled between them, an offer of freedom that somehow felt more binding than any vow. "I don't want to leave," Mara said quietly. Calder's hand stilled on the fire poker. "You don't?" "No, I want—" She struggled to articulate what she was feeling. "I want to see what happens next, with the ranch, with you, with us." "Us." He tested the word carefully. "I like the sound of that." "So do I." That night, Calder didn't immediately head upstairs. They sat by the fire together until the embers died, talking about nothing and everything. The kind of conversation that builds bridges between strangers. When they finally retired, Mara lay in her bed listening to the sounds of the house settling and realized something fundamental had changed. This didn't feel like a prison anymore. It felt like possibility. The peace lasted exactly 6 more days. On the 7th day, Raymond Ellison arrived with 2 hired men and trouble in his eyes. Mara was in the chicken coop collecting eggs when she heard the wagon approaching. She emerged to see Raymond climbing down, his expression cold and calculating. The 2 men with him were rough types, hired muscle, clearly, with guns on their hips and meanness in their faces. Calder was working near the barn, repairing fence posts. He straightened when he saw the visitors, his body language immediately wary. "Raymond," Mara called out, walking toward them with forced calm. "What are you doing here?" "Making sure my investment is secure," Raymond said smoothly. "Heard some interesting rumors in town. Thought I'd come see for myself." "What kind of rumors?" "That you've been playing doctor, performing medical procedures without training or authority." His smile was sharp. "That's illegal, Mara. Could get someone killed." Mara's blood went cold. Someone had talked, probably Mrs. Brennan at the general store or one of the other patients at Holloway's office. News traveled fast in small towns, and scandal traveled faster. "I helped my husband," she said evenly. "That's not illegal." "Isn't it?" Raymond gestured to one of his hired men. "Medical malpractice is a serious charge. Could mean jail time, fines the family would have to pay." "What do you want, Raymond?" "I want what's fair." He pulled a paper from his coat, legal-looking, official. "This is a contract addendum. States that in the event of any legal trouble arising from your actions, the debt reverts to the Ellison family, specifically to you." "That's not how contracts work." "This one does. I had a lawyer draw it up special." His smile widened. "All you have to do is sign and acknowledge that any consequences from your little medical experiment are yours alone. Voss here goes free, the ranch stays his, and you take responsibility for your reckless behavior." Calder had approached during the exchange, his expression dark. "She's not signing anything." "Oh, but she is." Raymond nodded to his men. They moved to flank him, hands resting casually on their guns. Because if she doesn't, I'll press charges. Medical malpractice, practicing medicine without a license, reckless endangerment. Take your pick. And when the court seizes this property to pay the fines, you'll both end up with nothing. You can't do this, Mara said, but her voice lacked conviction. Raymond had always been clever with legal manipulation. If he'd found a way to weaponize her actions, he would. I can and I will, unless you cooperate. He held out a pen. Sign, Mara. Take responsibility for your choices, or watch everything burn. Calder stepped between them. Get off my property. This won't be your property much longer if she doesn't sign. Raymond's voice was silk over steel. I'm doing you a favor, Voss. Letting you keep your land. All she has to do is admit what she did was wrong. It wasn't wrong. Calder's voice was steady, certain. She saved my life. Did she? Or did she get lucky? What if that thing had gone deeper? What if she'd caused infection or brain damage? Pure luck isn't medicine, Mr. Voss. It's just luck. Mara felt the weight of choice crushing down on her. Sign the paper, take the blame, protect Calder and the ranch. Or refuse and watch Raymond destroy everything they'd started building. She reached for the pen. No, Calder's hand caught hers. Don't. I have to. You don't. He turned to Raymond, his expression harder than Mara had ever seen it. My wife isn't signing anything, and you're leaving, now. One of Raymond's hired men shifted, his hand moving toward his gun. That's not how this works. Then let me explain how it works. Calder's voice dropped to something dangerous. This is my land. You're trespassing, and I have every right to defend my property and my wife from threats. You threatening us? The second hired man laughed. You're one man. We're three, and we're armed. So am I. Calder pulled back his coat, revealing a revolver holstered at his hip. And unlike you, I actually know my way around a gun. Spent 10 years as a ranch hand before I bought this place. Had to put down rustlers more than once. The tension ratcheted up immediately. Mara's heart hammered against her ribs. Calder, she whispered, don't. I'm not letting him take you. His eyes never left Raymond. I'm not letting anyone take you. You're my wife, my partner, and if standing up to these thugs means I end up dead, so be it, but I'm not backing down. Raymond's confidence flickered. He'd expected Calder to be weak, easy to intimidate. The man standing before him was anything but. This isn't over, Raymond said tightly. I'll come back with the sheriff. With legal authority. Do that, and I'll show them your contract and explain how you tried to extort my wife into signing under duress. With witnesses. Calder gestured around the ranch. I may not have people nearby, but I've got neighbors within shouting distance. Push this, and you'll be the one facing charges. The standoff held for an endless moment. Then Raymond jerked his head toward his men. Let's go. They climbed back into their wagon, Raymond's face twisted with impotent rage. As they pulled away, he called back, You haven't won, Mara. You just bought yourself time. The wagon disappeared down the track, leaving Mara and Calder standing in the yard, both shaking with adrenaline. I can't believe you did that, Mara said. Neither can I. Calder holstered his gun with trembling hands. I thought I was going to have to shoot someone. Would you have? He looked at her, his expression raw. For you? Yes, absolutely. The confession hung between them, more intimate than any touch, more binding than any vow. Mara stepped closer and, for the first time since they'd married, deliberately took his hand. We need to be ready. Raymond meant what he said. He'll come back. Let him. Calder's fingers tightened around hers. We'll face it together. Together, Mara echoed. And in that moment, their marriage stopped being a transaction and became something real. They spent that evening preparing for war. Calder checked the ammunition supply, while Mara inventoried their food stores and water. Neither spoke much, but they moved around each other with new awareness. A partnership forged in crisis, strengthened by choice. Every so often, their eyes would meet across the room, and something unspoken would pass between them. A promise. A commitment. We could leave, Mara said as darkness fell. Pack up, head west, start somewhere new. Calder looked up from cleaning his rifle. Is that what you want? I'm asking what you want. He set the gun down carefully. I want to stay. This ranch, it's the only thing I've ever built that's mine. Running feels like letting Raymond win. He paused. But if you want to go, we go. Your safety matters more than land. Mara walked to the window, staring out at the darkened landscape. She'd spent her whole life running from one disaster to the next, always reactive, never in control. The thought of running again made something in her chest constrict with anger. I'm tired of being pushed around, she said quietly. Tired of men deciding what happens to me. Raymond, my father, every creditor who ever knocked on our door, they all treated me like property, like I had no say in my own life. You have a say now. Do I? She turned to face him. Or am I just trading one set of chains for another? Calder flinched as if struck. If that's how you see this marriage, that's not what I meant. Mara crossed the room and sat beside him. I mean that I'm tired of other people making choices for me. Raymond showed up here expecting me to fold. Expected you to fold. And I'm done folding. Understanding dawned in Calder's eyes. You want to fight. I want to stand my ground. There's a difference. She met his gaze steadily. I saved your life because it was the right thing to do. Not illegal. Not wrong. Right. And I'm not going to let Raymond twist that into something shameful. He'll come back with the law. Then we'll deal with the law, honestly, openly. She took a breath. Dr. Holloway documented everything. He can testify that what I did was medically sound, that you're better because of it. That counts for something. In a perfect world, maybe. Calder's voice was grim. But we don't live in a perfect world. We live in a world where women aren't supposed to know more than doctors, where desperation gets punished and innovation gets called reckless. Then we change that world, one testimony at a time. Calder studied her for a long moment, something like admiration flickering across his face. You're braver than I am. No, I'm just angrier. She smiled without humor. Anger's a good fuel, burns hot and long. They sat together in the firelight, planning their defense. If Raymond returned with legal authority, they'd need documentation. Proof that Mara had acted out of medical necessity, not recklessness. Proof that Calder had consented. Proof that the outcome had been successful. We should talk to the neighbors, Calder said. The Hendersons to the south, the Matsons to the east. Let them know what's happening. If Raymond tries something, burns the barn, salts the fields, any of the dirty tricks men like him use, we'll need witnesses. Will they help us? I thought you said you kept to yourself. I did, but that doesn't mean they're bad people. Just means I never gave them reason to know me. He stood, rolling his shoulders as if shaking off old habits. Time to change that too. The next morning they rode out together, visiting the scattered ranches that made up their corner of the territory. Calder introduced Mara properly for the first time, not as an obligation or a transaction, but as his wife and partner. The difference in how he spoke about her was subtle but unmistakable. Thomas Henderson was a weathered man in his 60s who ran cattle on land adjacent to Calder's property. His wife Martha had died 2 years prior, and he lived alone with his adult son James. When Calder explained the situation, Henderson's expression darkened. Raymond Ellison, he spat. I know that snake. Tried to buy my land last year when I fell behind on taxes. Offered half what it was worth and acted like he was doing me a favor. What did you do? Mara asked. Told him to go to hell. Sold some cattle, caught up on the taxes, and kept my land. Henderson looked at her shrewdly. So you're the one who pulled that thing out of Calder's ear. News travels fast. In small towns, it's the only entertainment. He grinned, showing missing teeth. Doc Holloway's been telling everyone who'll listen. Says it's the most remarkable thing he's seen in 30 years of practice. Says you've got instincts that can't be taught. Mara felt heat rise to her face. I just did what needed doing. That's all any of us can do. Henderson clapped Calder on the shoulder. You've got trouble, you let me know. James and I will come running. Nobody pushes out a neighbor on my watch. The Matsons were younger, a couple in their 30s with 3 small children. Ellen Matson was heavily pregnant with their 4th, moving slowly but with determined grace. Her husband Robert listened to Calder's explanation with growing anger. Medical malpractice, Robert scoffed. That's what they're calling it? My Ellen nearly died giving birth to our 2nd. Doctor in town said there was nothing to be done, that we should prepare for the worst. You know what saved her? The midwife from the next county over. She came in, looked at the situation fresh, and did what needed doing. No fancy degree, just skill and courage. Ellen nodded emphatically. If I'd listened to that doctor, I'd be dead. And so would the baby. Sometimes the answer isn't in a textbook. Sometimes it's just common sense and determination. We'll testify if it comes to that, Robert said firmly. Won't let them railroad you for having the guts to help your husband. They visited 4 more ranches that day, and the story was the same at each one. Frontier people understood that survival often meant doing things yourself, improvising, taking risks that would be considered reckless in more civilized places. Book learning was fine, but lived experience counted for more. By the time they returned home that evening, Mara felt something she hadn't felt in years, supported. These people barely knew her, but they were willing to stand with her because they understood what it meant to be pushed around by men with money and legal documents. Thank you, she said to Calder as they unhitched the wagon, for taking me to meet them. They deserve to know what was happening, and you deserve to know you're not alone in this. Mara set down the harness she'd been carrying and turned to face him fully. The setting sun cast everything in gold and amber, softening the hard edges of the ranch, making it look almost beautiful. Calder, she said carefully, what are we doing here? What do you mean? This marriage, this partnership, what is it becoming? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he finished unhitching the horses and led them to the barn. Mara followed, waiting. She'd learned that Calder needed time to process his thoughts, to find the right words. Finally, inside the barn with the horses munching hay, he spoke. When I married you, it was a transaction. I needed help, you needed escape, and it seemed like the practical solution to both problems. He leaned against a post, his silhouette dark against the fading light. But you weren't what I expected. You were supposed to be quiet and manageable and not ask questions. Instead, you were stubborn and curious, and you refused to let me suffer in silence. Is that a complaint? No. It's the best thing that ever happened to me. He moved closer. You gave me my life back, Mara, not just by removing that parasite, but by refusing to accept that pain was my only option. You made me believe things could be different. Mara's heart hammered in her chest. And now? Now I want this marriage to be real, not a transaction, not a convenience, real. His voice dropped. If you want that too. The question hung between them, weighted with possibility and risk. Mara had spent so long protecting herself, building walls, refusing to hope for anything better than survival. But standing here in the gathering darkness with this man who'd faced down her brother with a gun and offered her freedom even when it meant his own loss, she felt those walls crumbling. I want that too, she whispered. Calder's hand found hers in the darkness, his fingers rough and warm. Then we'll figure it out. Together. Together, she echoed, and the word felt like a vow more binding than anything spoken at their wedding. They stood there for a moment longer, just holding hands in the quiet barn while the world shifted around them. Then practical concerns reasserted themselves, and they headed back to the house to prepare dinner. But something fundamental had changed. The touches were more deliberate now, hands brushing as they passed in the kitchen, shoulders bumping as they worked side by side. The conversation flowed easier, punctuated by shared laughter and comfortable silences. When they sat by the fire that night, they sat closer, their knees touching. Tell me about your mother, Calder said. What was she like? Mara smiled, the memory bittersweet. Strong. Stronger than anyone gave her credit for. She grew up poor but educated herself by reading everything she could find. When she married my father, he was still ambitious, still working. She helped him build his business, managed the books, negotiated with suppliers. The smile faded. When she died, everything fell apart. Father couldn't function without her. And Raymond learned all the wrong lessons from watching her. He learned that strength meant control, that intelligence meant manipulation. You learned different lessons. I learned that strength without compassion is just cruelty, that intelligence without ethics is just scheming. She looked at him. What about you? What did your parents teach you? Calder's expression grew distant. They taught me that the land doesn't care about your intentions. that survival means hard work and harder choices. They died when I was 17, both of them in a winter fever. I was left with nothing but debts and decisions. Is that when the headaches started? Started getting worse then, yeah. The pain had been there for a couple years, but after they died, it became unbearable. I think the stress made it worse. He rubbed his jaw. I sold what was left of their land, used the money to work my way west. Figured if I was going to suffer, I'd rather do it on my own terms in my own place. And you built all this? Built it. Nearly lost it a dozen times, but kept fighting. He met her eyes. Same as you. We're both fighters, Mara. Just took us a while to recognize it in each other. The fire crackled, sending shadows dancing across the walls. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the promise of coming snow. Winter was settling in hard, and with it, the isolation that would make Raymond's threats even more dangerous. When do you think he'll come back? Mara asked. Soon. Raymond's not the patient type. He'll want to press his advantage while he thinks we're scared. Calder's jaw set. He's going to be disappointed. 3 days later, Raymond returned, but not with the sheriff. He came with something worse, a banker and a lawyer, both dressed in city clothes that looked absurd against the frozen landscape. And he came with a document that could destroy everything. Mara was hanging laundry when she saw the wagon approach. Her stomach dropped. She called for Calder, who emerged from the barn with his rifle, his expression grim. The wagon stopped at a careful distance. Raymond climbed down, flanked by the two professionals. The lawyer was a thin man with spectacles and a permanent sneer. The banker was round and prosperous-looking, clearly uncomfortable with the rural setting. Mr. Voss? Mrs. Voss? Raymond's voice was sickeningly polite. I've brought some associates who need to discuss your situation. We have no situation to discuss, Calder said flatly. I'm afraid you do. The lawyer stepped forward, producing papers from his leather case. I'm Herbert Finch, representing the First Territorial Bank. It's come to our attention that this property may be subject to seizure due to outstanding debts and potential illegal activity. What illegal activity? Mara demanded. The unauthorized practice of medicine, Mrs. Voss. A serious offense that carries both criminal and civil penalties. Finch adjusted his spectacles. Additionally, there's the matter of Mr. Voss's original loan, which was contingent on maintaining the property in good order. The bank has received reports that you've been unable to work, Mr. Voss, which constitutes a breach of contract. I've been working fine, Calder said through clenched teeth. Have you? Or have you been incapacitated by this alleged medical condition that your wife claims to have treated? Finch's smile was razor sharp. You can't have it both ways. Either you were genuinely ill, in which case you breached your loan agreement, or you weren't ill, in which case your wife committed fraud by claiming medical necessity for her actions. The trap closed around them with elegant precision. Raymond had thought this through carefully, find an angle that damned them no matter which way they turned. This is extortion, Mara said, her voice shaking with rage. This is business, the banker said, speaking for the first time. His voice was nasal and irritating. The bank has a right to protect its interests. If this property is at risk due to legal troubles or medical incapacity, we must act accordingly. What do you want? Calder asked, though the defeat in his voice suggested he already knew. Raymond stepped forward, his expression triumphant. Simple. Sign the property over to me at a fair price. I'll assume the debt, pay off the bank, and you two can walk away clean. No criminal charges, no bankruptcy, no scandal, just a clean sale between family. At what price? Mara asked. $200. The number was insulting. The ranch was worth at least 5 times that, probably more. But Raymond had structured the situation so that refusing meant losing everything anyway. You bastard, Mara breathed. I'm a businessman. There's a difference. Raymond's smile widened. You have until Friday to decide. Either sign the sale agreement, or I file charges and the bank initiates foreclosure. Your choice. That's 3 days, Calder said. Should be plenty of time to pack. Raymond climbed back into the wagon, followed by his professional accomplices. Think carefully, Mr. Voss. Think about your wife's future. A criminal record is a heavy burden for a woman to carry. They drove away, leaving Mara and Calder standing in the yard, the legal papers scattered on the ground like fallen leaves. Mara picked them up with trembling hands, reading through the dense legal language. Everything Raymond had said was true. The contract was airtight. The trap was perfect. "We're finished," Calder said hollowly. "He's won." "No." Mara's voice was steel. "No, he hasn't." "Well, Mara, look at those documents. He's got us cornered. If we fight, we lose everything, and you end up with a criminal record. If we don't fight, we lose everything anyway." "Then we burn it all down." Calder stared at her. "What?" "If he wants this ranch so badly, let him have the ashes." She met his eyes, her expression fierce. "We can't save the property. Fine, but we can make damn sure he doesn't profit from stealing it." "You're talking about arson." "I'm talking about justice." Mara's hands clenched on the papers. "We strip this place bare, sell off everything that can be sold, the cattle, the horses, the tools, every stick of furniture. Take that money and leave. And whatever can't be sold, we destroy. Let him buy a pile of rubble for his $200. "That's insane. That's defiance." She grabbed his shoulders. "I won't let him win, Calder. I won't let him take what we've built and profit from it. If we're going down fighting." Calder searched her face, seeing the determination there, the absolute refusal to surrender. And slowly, something shifted in his expression, from despair to something darker and more dangerous. "All right," he said quietly, "let's burn it all down." They spent the next day liquidating everything they could. The Hendersons bought the cattle at fair price, understanding what was happening without needing explanation. The Matsons took the horses and wagon, tools, furniture, supplies. Everything was sold or given away to their neighbors, who paid what they could and promised to keep the items safe until Mara and Calder could reclaim them someday. By Thursday evening, the house was stripped bare. Empty rooms echoed with their footsteps. Outside, the barn stood vacant, a hollow shell. "Tomorrow night," Calder said, "after dark. We'll torch the barn first, then the house. Make it look like an accident, knocked over lamp maybe. Then we leave. Head west and don't look back." Mara nodded, her throat tight. This ranch had become home in the brief weeks she'd been here. Losing it felt like tearing off a piece of herself. But losing it to Raymond felt worse than death. That night, she lay awake in her empty room, listening to the house settle. At some point, she heard footsteps and then a soft knock on her door. "Come in," she said. Calder entered, barely visible in the darkness. "Couldn't sleep." "Neither could I." He sat on the edge of her bed, a mattress on the floor now, the frame having been sold. "I keep thinking about what we're losing, what he's taking from us." "I know. And I keep thinking that you deserve better than this, better than being dragged into my mess, forced to run, to start over with nothing." Mara sat up, reaching for his hand in the darkness. "I'm not being dragged anywhere. I'm choosing this, choosing you, choosing to stand up instead of bend." "Why? What did I ever do to earn that kind of loyalty?" "You saw me." Her voice was fierce in the darkness. "When everyone else looked at me and saw a burden or a bargain, you saw a person, a partner, someone worth standing up for." She squeezed his hand. "That's worth more than any ranch." Calder was silent for a long moment. Then, carefully, he lay down beside her on the thin mattress. Not touching, just close, present. "Thank you," he whispered. "For what?" "For making me believe I was worth saving, worth fighting for." His voice broke slightly. "No one's ever done that before." Mara rolled to face him, their faces inches apart in the darkness. Then they were fools. She closed the distance and kissed him, gentle at first, then deeper as he responded. His hands came up to frame her face, reverent and careful, as if she were something precious that might break. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Calder rested his forehead against hers. "Whatever happens tomorrow," he said, "whatever we face, I want you to know that these weeks with you have been the best of my life. Even with all the chaos, even facing losing everything, you made it worth it." "We're not losing everything," Mara corrected. "We're choosing what matters and burning the rest." Spoken like someone who's never been burned. "I've been burned plenty." She kissed him again, softer this time. "The difference is, this time I'm holding the match." They lay together in the darkness, holding each other, gathering strength for what was coming. Tomorrow they would burn the ranch and leave everything behind. Tomorrow they would become fugitives from Raymond's version of justice. But tonight, in the empty house on the edge of winter, they were just two people who'd found each other against all odds and refused to let go. Friday dawned cold and clear, perfect conditions for arson, Mara thought with grim humor. They spent the day making final preparations, gathering the few possessions they'd kept: clothes, documents, the medical book that had started everything, and the money from selling their belongings. It wasn't much, but it was enough to start over somewhere new. As dusk fell, they doused the barn in lamp oil, creating a trail that would burn fast and hot. Calder stood with the matches in his hand, his expression carved from stone. "Once we do this, there's no going back," he said. "I know. Raymond will know it was us. We'll probably press charges anyway." "Let him try. We'll be long gone." Calder struck the match, the small flame bright in the gathering darkness. For a moment he just held it, watching it burn down toward his fingers. Then he dropped it onto the oil-soaked wood. The fire caught instantly, racing along the trail of fuel with hungry enthusiasm. Within minutes, the barn was engulfed, flames reaching toward the darkening sky like prayers or curses. They stood watching it burn, neither speaking. The heat was intense even at a distance, making the frozen air shimmer. Smoke billowed up, black and thick, visible for miles. "Someone will see," Mara said. "They'll come. Let them. By the time they arrive, there'll be nothing left to save." But they were wrong about who would come. Through the smoke and flames, 3 wagons appeared on the track leading to the ranch. Not the sheriff or Raymond, but Henderson, the Matsons, and 4 other neighboring families. They came with water barrels and blankets, ready to fight the fire. Thomas Henderson jumped down from his wagon, took one look at Calder and Mara standing back from the blaze, and understood immediately. "You're burning it yourselves," he said flatly. "Yes," Calder replied, expecting condemnation. Instead, Henderson turned to the others and shouted, "Stand down! This fire's intentional! Let it burn!" Robert Matson approached, his face grim. "Raymond showed up at our place this morning, bragging about how he'd squeezed you out, how he'd owned this land by week's end, showed us the papers." He spat into the dirt. "That's when we knew. When we decided." "Decided what?" Mara asked. "That we'd had enough." Ellen Matson stepped forward, her pregnant belly prominent even under her heavy coat. "Enough of men like Raymond pushing folks around. Enough of letting bullies win because we're too scared or too tired to fight back." "We can't stop the legal process," Henderson said. "But we can make damn sure he doesn't enjoy his victory. Every one of us refuses to do business with him, won't sell him supplies, won't help with his cattle, won't acknowledge him in town. We'll make him as isolated as he tried to make you." Mara felt tears sting her eyes. "You'd do that? Risk his retaliation?" "He can't retaliate against all of us," Matson said firmly. "That's the thing about bullies. They only have power when people stand alone. Together, we're stronger than any legal document." The barn collapsed in on itself with a groan of timber and burst of sparks. The heat was tremendous, forcing them all to step back. "You don't have to burn the house," Henderson said. "We can help you fight this properly. Get a better lawyer, document everything, make a real case." Calder and Mara exchanged glances. In the firelight, his face was half shadow, half gold. "What do you think?" he asked her. Mara looked at the assembled neighbors, people who barely knew them but were willing to stand with them anyway. People who understood that what was happening here was about more than one ranch or one debt. It was about whether communities would protect their own or let them be picked off one by men with money and power. "I think," she said slowly, "that we stop running, that we fight, and that we make damn sure everyone knows exactly what Raymond Ellison tried to do here." Henderson grinned, fierce and satisfied. "That's what I was hoping you'd say." They worked through the night by the light of the burning barn, formulating a plan that would either save them or destroy them completely. Henderson sent his son James to fetch a lawyer from the next county, someone who owed him a favor and wouldn't be intimidated by Raymond's money. The Matsons organized a rotation of families who would stay at the ranch to witness and document everything that happened. Others rode to town to spread the word about what Raymond had tried to do. By dawn, the barn was nothing but smoking ruins and ash, but the house still stood, and surrounding it was a community that had decided to make a stand. Mara watched the sun rise over the blackened remains of the barn, Calder's arm around her shoulders. She felt hollowed out and simultaneously more alive than she'd ever been. They'd come so close to running, to letting Raymond win through fear and intimidation. But these people, these rough, hardscrabble frontier families, had reminded her that courage was contagious. "What do you think Raymond will do when he finds out?" she asked. "Probably lose his mind," Calder said with grim satisfaction. He spent years building a reputation as someone too powerful to cross. Having an entire community turn against him will destroy that. Good. Dr. Holloway arrived mid-morning, summoned by one of the Matson children. He took one look at the gathered families and the burned barn and immediately understood the situation. "I've been expecting something like this," he said, climbing down from his buggy. "Raymond came to my office 2 days ago, trying to get me to recant my statements about the parasite. Offered me money to say I'd been mistaken, that there was no medical validity to what Mrs. Voss had done." Mara's stomach clenched. "What did you tell him?" "I told him to get out of my office before I reported him for attempted bribery of a medical professional." Holloway's expression was fierce. "I've been practicing medicine for 30 years, Mrs. Voss. I know what I saw. That parasite was real, your extraction was successful, and Mr. Voss's recovery is documented proof. No amount of money will make me lie about that. Will you testify to that? Publicly?" "I'll do better than that." Holloway pulled a thick folder from his bag. "I've written a complete case study with drawings and descriptions. I sent copies to 3 medical journals before Raymond ever approached me. Even if he somehow silences me, the evidence is already out there in the medical community. Your actions are now part of the scientific record." Tears stung Mara's eyes. She'd been prepared to fight alone, to have every authority figure dismiss or condemn her. Having a doctor, a real credentialed professional, stand up for her felt like vindication she hadn't known she needed. "Thank you," she managed. "Don't thank me. You did something remarkable. The medical community should be celebrating you, not prosecuting you." Holloway's voice hardened. "And I intend to make sure they know the difference." The lawyer arrived that afternoon, a woman, which surprised everyone. Her name was Margaret Chen, and she was sharply intelligent with eyes that missed nothing. She'd come west from San Francisco 5 years prior, establishing a practice that specialized in defending people the law typically ignored: women, immigrants, homesteaders facing corporate land grabs. "Thomas Henderson says you're being railroaded by your brother," she said to Mara without preamble. "Tell me everything. Leave nothing out." They sat in the stripped-bare house while Mara recounted the whole story: the forced marriage, the debt, the parasite extraction, Raymond's threats, the legal trap he'd constructed. Margaret took notes with quick, efficient strokes, occasionally asking pointed questions. "The practice of medicine without a license," she said thoughtfully. "That's what they're hanging this on. But there are precedents we can use: spousal care exemptions, emergency medical situations, Good Samaritan principles, and the fact that no doctor would or could have helped adds weight to the necessity defense." "Will that be enough?" Calder asked. "Honestly, I don't know. Frontier law is unpredictable. A lot depends on the judge, the jury, public sentiment." Margaret looked up from her notes. "But here's what I do know. Raymond Ellison has overplayed his hand. He's not just attacking you, he's attacking the very foundations of frontier self-reliance. Every person in this territory has had to make hard choices, perform emergency medicine, take risks that would be illegal in a city. If we frame this correctly, Raymond's prosecution becomes an attack on everyone." "That's what we've been trying to tell them," Henderson said from his position by the door. "This isn't just about the Vosses. It's about whether we bow to men with money or stand up for our own." "Then that's our defense," Margaret said crisply. "We make this trial about community values versus legal oppression. We put Raymond Ellison on trial instead of Mrs. Voss." Over the next 2 days, more families arrived from surrounding areas. Word had spread about what was happening, about Raymond's attempt to steal the ranch, about the community's resistance, about the trial that would determine whether frontier people had the right to help each other without fear of prosecution. By Sunday evening, there were nearly 40 people camped around the Voss property. Raymond arrived Monday morning with the sheriff and 4 deputies, clearly expecting to find Mara and Calder alone and vulnerable. Instead, he found a small army of witnesses. The sheriff, a tired-looking man named Porter, climbed down from his horse and surveyed the scene with obvious displeasure. "What's going on here?" "Community gathering," Henderson said mildly. "Nothing illegal about neighbors visiting neighbors." "This looks like intimidation," Raymond snapped. "You're trying to interfere with legal proceedings." "No, we're making sure those proceedings are conducted fairly." Margaret Chen stepped forward, every inch the professional. "I'm Mrs. Voss's legal counsel. Any further communication should go through me." Raymond's face darkened when he saw her. "Margaret Chen, should have known you'd stick your nose in this." "Should have known you'd try to steal someone's land," Margaret replied coolly. "Some things never change, Raymond." "You two know each other?" Mara asked. "Ms. Chen represented a client who successfully sued my brother for fraud 3 years ago," Raymond said tightly. "Cost him a significant settlement." "Because he defrauded a widow out of her inheritance," Margaret corrected. "And I'd do it again in a heartbeat." Sheriff Porter held up his hands. "Enough. I'm here to serve papers, not referee old grudges." He pulled a document from his coat. "Mrs. Mara Voss, you're hereby summoned to appear before Judge Whitmore on Friday to answer charges of practicing medicine without a license. Trial's set for the following Monday, if you don't settle before then." Mara stepped forward and took the papers with steady hands. "I'll be there." "With full legal representation," Margaret added, "and we'll be filing countercharges of extortion, attempted fraud, and conspiracy to illegally seize property." Raymond's confident expression flickered. "Countercharges? Did you think we wouldn't fight back?" Margaret smiled without warmth. "You tried to use the legal system as a weapon. Now you get to experience it as a shield." "Those charges won't stick. I have documentation." "So do we, including testimony from Dr. Holloway about your attempted bribery, from multiple witnesses about your threats and intimidation, and from every person here about your reputation for predatory business practices." Margaret's voice was steel-wrapped in silk. "You wanted a legal battle, Raymond. Congratulations, you're getting one." The sheriff looked between them, clearly wanting no part of this fight. "Friday, 10 o'clock. Don't be late." He remounted and gestured for his deputies to follow. Raymond remained behind, his face twisted with rage, and something else. Fear, maybe, or the dawning realization that he'd underestimated his opponents. "You're making a mistake," he said to Mara. "All of you. I offered you a clean way out. Now you're going to lose everything and face jail time besides." "We'll see," Mara said quietly. "Maybe this time the bully doesn't win." "I'm not a bully. I'm a businessman protecting my interests." "You're a coward who hides behind lawyers because you can't face people honestly." The words came out harder than Mara intended, but she didn't take them back. "You sold me like property. You tried to steal this ranch through legal manipulation. You threatened to destroy my husband's life because he dared to get better. If that's business, then business is just another word for cruelty." Raymond's hand moved toward his coat, a threatening gesture, but Henderson and 3 other men immediately stepped forward. The message was clear. Violence would be met with violence. "Friday," Raymond said through clenched teeth. Then he turned and stalked back to his wagon. They watched him drive away, dust rising behind his wheels like smoke. "Well," Henderson said into the silence, "that went better than expected." "Did it?" Calder's voice was strained. "We've got 4 days to prepare for a trial that could end with Mara in jail and us losing everything anyway." "Then we use those 4 days well," Margaret said briskly. "I need detailed statements from everyone who witnessed Raymond's threats, medical documentation from Dr. Holloway, character witnesses willing to testify about Mrs. Voss's intelligence and capability, and we need to prepare Mrs. Voss herself to testify." "Testify?" Mara felt her stomach drop. "I have to speak in court?" "Absolutely. Your testimony will be crucial. The jury needs to see you as a real person, not some reckless woman playing doctor." Margaret's expression softened slightly. "I know it's intimidating, but you saved your husband's life through courage and intelligence. You can certainly face down a courtroom." The next 4 days passed in a blur of preparation. Margaret drilled Mara on testimony, teaching her how to answer questions clearly without volunteering information that could be used against her. Dr. Holloway went over medical terminology, making sure Mara could explain what she'd done in language that sounded competent rather than reckless. Calder provided emotional support, staying close, reminding her why they were fighting. The neighboring families organized a defense fund, each contributing what they could. It wasn't much. Frontier people rarely had surplus money, but the gesture meant everything. They were investing not just in Mara and Calder's defense, but in the principle that communities protected their own. Thursday night, Mara couldn't sleep. She stood at the window of their bedroom. Calder had moved upstairs permanently now, their relationship having evolved past separate spaces, and stared out at the blackened skeleton of the barn. Tomorrow, everything would be decided. Her freedom, their future, the message sent about whether frontier women had the right to act in emergencies. "You're going to be brilliant tomorrow," Calder said from the bed. Mara turned to find him watching her, his expression soft with love and concern. When had that happened? When had this transaction become love? She couldn't pinpoint a single moment. It had grown gradually, built from shared danger and mutual respect, and the simple choice to stand together when running apart would have been easier. What if I'm not? What if I freeze up or say the wrong thing? Then we'll deal with it. Together. He held out his hand. "Come here." She crossed to the bed and let him pull her down beside him, his arms wrapped around her, solid and warm and real. "I'm scared," she admitted. "So am I. But I'm also proud. Of you. Of us. Of what we've built here." He kissed her forehead. "Win or lose tomorrow, we did something important. We stood up. We fought back. That matters." "But does it? If we lose everything anyway?" "Yes. Because the next person facing a bully like Raymond will remember what we did. Will know they don't have to face it alone. Courage spreads, Mara. Same as fear. We chose which one to plant." She held him tighter, drawing strength from his certainty. Whatever happened tomorrow, at least they'd face it together. Friday morning dawned clear and cold. They dressed in their best clothes. Not much, given what they'd sold, but clean and respectable. Margaret arrived early to go over last-minute strategy. "Remember," she said as they prepared to leave, "you're not on trial for what you did. You're on trial for daring to do it without permission. Our job is to make the jury understand that sometimes permission comes too late to save a life." The courthouse was packed. Every seat in the gallery was filled, with more people standing in the back and spilling out into the hallway. Mara recognized most of them, neighbors, townspeople, even some she'd never met who'd heard about the case and come to witness frontier justice in action. Judge Whitmore was a stern-looking woman in her 60s who'd served on the territorial bench for 20 years. She had a reputation for fairness, but also for strict interpretation of the law. Margaret had warned that she could go either way. Raymond sat at the prosecution table with Herbert Finch, both looking confident. They had the law on their side. That was undeniable. Medical licensing existed for a reason, and Mara had clearly violated it. But they hadn't counted on the power of narrative. Margaret's opening statement was masterful. She painted a picture of a young woman trapped in an impossible situation, married to a man suffering unbearably, dismissed by every doctor who'd examined him, watching him slowly die because the medical establishment had decided his pain was untreatable. Mrs. Voss had a choice, Margaret told the jury. She could follow the rules and watch her husband suffer for the rest of his life. Or she could break the rules and possibly save him. She chose courage over compliance. She chose love over law. And she succeeded where trained professionals had failed for 20 years. Finch's counter was predictable but effective. The law exists to protect people from harm. Mrs. Voss, however well-intentioned, had no training, no expertise, no right to perform a medical procedure. She got lucky. The next person who tries something similar might not be. We cannot set a precedent that anyone can play doctor simply because they disagree with professional medical opinions. The prosecution called its first witness, a doctor from the territorial capital who testified about the dangers of untrained medical intervention. He described all the ways Mara's extraction could have gone wrong, painting a picture of reckless endangerment. Margaret's cross-examination was surgical. "Doctor, how many of your patients suffer from chronic pain that you cannot diagnose or treat?" "Some, certainly." "And what do you tell those patients when your expertise fails them?" "I tell them we're doing everything we can. But you're not, are you? You're doing everything within the bounds of accepted practice. That's different from everything possible. Medicine has rules for a reason. Yes, to protect patients from harm. But what about protecting them from suffering? If all your rules and expertise leave a patient in agony for 20 years, at what point does the rule become more harmful than breaking it? The doctor had no good answer to that. Dr. Holloway testified next, and his presence shifted the entire tone of the trial. He brought medical diagrams, the preserved parasite, detailed notes on Calder's condition before and after the extraction. He spoke with authority and passion about what Mara had accomplished. "I've been practicing medicine for 3 decades, he said firmly. "I've seen thousands of patients, consulted on hundreds of difficult cases. What Mrs. Voss did, identifying the cause when no one else could, performing the extraction successfully without training, represents the kind of medical intuition that cannot be taught. It can only be recognized and respected." "But she broke the law," Finch interjected. "So did the doctors who first performed blood transfusions. So did the surgeons who pioneered anesthesia. Medical progress has always required someone to break rules that no longer serve patients." Holloway looked directly at the jury. "Mrs. Voss saved her husband's life. In any just society, that should be celebrated, not prosecuted." The courtroom erupted in applause. Judge Whitmore gavelled for order but couldn't completely hide her own thoughtful expression. Then it was Mara's turn to testify. She walked to the stand on trembling legs, acutely aware of every eye on her. Margaret had coached her to speak clearly, to look at the jury, to tell her story without apology. "Mrs. Voss," Margaret began, "please tell the court why you decided to examine your husband's ear." Mara took a breath and began. She described watching Calder suffer, the way pain had carved itself into his bones, the medical books she'd read, the pattern of symptoms that suggested something localized and physical, the growing certainty that everyone had overlooked something simple because they'd assumed the answer had to be complex. "I knew it was dangerous," she said. "I knew I could make things worse, but doing nothing was also a choice. And I couldn't. I couldn't watch him suffer anymore when there might be something I could do." "And when you removed the parasite, what did you feel?" "Terror, relief, guilt that it had been there for 20 years and no one had looked hard enough to find it." Mara's voice strengthened. "And anger. Anger that my husband had suffered unnecessarily because doctors were too arrogant to consider that they might have missed something." Finch's cross-examination was aggressive. He tried to paint her as reckless, emotional, dismissive of professional expertise. But Mara held her ground. "You're not a doctor," he said sharply. "No, but I'm not blind either. I saw what was there. That doesn't require a medical degree. You endangered your husband's life. My husband's life was already in danger. He was slowly dying from constant pain. I gave him a chance to live. That's not endangerment. That's hope." "But you had no right." "I had every right." Mara leaned forward, her voice ringing through the courtroom. "I'm his wife, his partner, the person who shares his life. If anyone had the right to try to save him, it was me. Not some doctor who'd already given up. Not some medical board that never even examined him. Me." The courtroom erupted again. This time Judge Whitmore let it go for a moment before restoring order. Calder testified last, and his testimony was devastating in its simplicity. He described 20 years of agony, the doctors who'd dismissed him, the jobs he'd lost, the isolation he'd endured, and then Mara's arrival and her refusal to accept that his suffering was inevitable. "She saved my life," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Not just by removing that thing from my ear, but by refusing to believe I was beyond help. Every doctor I saw told me to learn to live with it. She told me I didn't have to, and she was right." "Even though she's not a doctor?" Finch pressed. "Especially because she's not a doctor. Doctors looked at me and saw a chronic pain case, a lost cause. My wife looked at me and saw a person worth saving." Calder met the lawyer's eyes. "If that's what medical practice without a license looks like, then every doctor should try it." The closing arguments happened that afternoon. Finch argued for the sanctity of medical licensing, the importance of professional standards, the danger of setting a precedent that anyone could perform medical procedures. Margaret argued for justice over law, for the recognition that frontier life required frontier solutions, for the understanding that love and courage sometimes accomplished what credentials could not. This case is simple, she told the jury. A woman saw her husband suffering and found a way to help him. She used intelligence, observation, and determination. She succeeded where trained professionals had failed, and now the state wants to punish her for that success. She paused, letting the absurdity sink in. Ask yourselves, if you were suffering, if no doctor could help you, if someone who loved you found an answer, would you want them prosecuted for saving your life? Judge Whitmore instructed the jury and sent them to deliberate. The wait was agonizing. Mara sat between Calder and Margaret, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. "How long do you think they'll take?" she whispered. "Hard to say. Could be hours. Could be days." Margaret's face was unreadable. "Try not to interpret the timing. Quick verdicts can go either way." But the jury returned after only 90 minutes. The foreman was a weathered rancher named Cooper, who Mara had never met. He stood when prompted, holding the verdict form. In the matter of the territory versus Mara Voss, on the charge of practicing medicine without a license, we, the jury, find the defendant. The pause seemed to last forever. Not guilty. The courtroom exploded. People cheered, cried, embraced. Mara felt her legs give out, would have collapsed if Calder hadn't caught her. Margaret was grinning fiercely, already gathering her papers. Judge Whitmore gavelled for order, but even she looked satisfied. "Mrs. Voss, you're free to go. The charges are dismissed." Raymond stood abruptly, his face purple with rage. "This is a mockery. She clearly violated—" "The jury has spoken, Mr. Ellison." Whitmore's voice was sharp. "And I must say, I find their verdict both just and appropriate. This court recognizes that frontier conditions sometimes require frontier solutions. Mrs. Voss acted out of necessity and love, and her actions had unequivocally positive results. This case is closed." She brought down the gavel with finality. Mara and Calder were surrounded immediately by well-wishers. Henderson clapped Calder on the back. Ellen Matson hugged Mara, tears streaming down her face. Dr. Holloway pushed through the crowd to shake their hands. "Justice," he said simply. "Actual justice. Doesn't happen often enough." Margaret accepted congratulations with professional grace, but pulled Mara aside as the crowd began to disperse. "We're not done yet," she said quietly. "What do you mean? The verdict clears you of criminal charges. But we still need to deal with the civil matter, the debt, the ranch, Raymond's claims." Margaret's expression was serious. "That's a separate battle, and Raymond's not going to let this go easily." As if summoned by his name, Raymond appeared before them, flanked by Finch. His expression was carefully controlled now, but fury burned in his eyes. "Congratulations," he said coldly. "You won your little trial, but the debt still stands, and the ranch still reverts to me by terms of the original contract." "Actually," Margaret said pleasantly, "it doesn't. I've filed paperwork with the Territorial Land Office showing that the property has been significantly damaged." She gestured toward the burned barn, "which violates the terms under which you agreed to assume the debt. The contract is void." Raymond's face went white. You can't." "I can, and I have." The fire was witnessed by dozens of people as an accident. The resulting damage makes the property worth significantly less than the debt amount. Therefore, by the terms of your own contract, you're no longer obligated to purchase it. The debt reverts to its original holder. She smiled. "Which means Mr. and Mrs. Voss now deal directly with the bank, not you. And I've already negotiated new payment terms based on the property's current diminished value." "You burned the barn deliberately to void my contract," Raymond snarled at Calder. "I burned my own barn on my own property," Calder said calmly. "Nothing illegal about that, just unfortunate timing." Raymond looked between them, finally understanding how completely he'd been outmaneuvered. His attempt to steal the ranch had backfired spectacularly. His reputation was destroyed. His legal threats had failed. And he'd lost any leverage he'd once had. "This isn't over," he said, but the words rang hollow. "Yes," Mara said quietly. "It is. Go home, Raymond. Find someone else to torment. We're done being your victims." Raymond stared at her for a long moment, then turned and strode from the courthouse. Finch followed, looking relieved to escape. The crowd outside erupted in cheers when Mara and Calder emerged. Someone had brought a fiddle and started playing. Impromptu celebration broke out in the street, dancing, singing, the kind of spontaneous joy that came from witnessing injustice defeated. Henderson pulled them into an embrace. "You did it. Both of you. Stood up to a bully and won." "We couldn't have done it without all of you," Mara said, gesturing to the crowd. "Without the community standing with us." "That's what community means," Ellen Matson said, appearing at her side. "Standing together when standing alone would mean falling. You taught us that." They celebrated long into the evening, but eventually exhaustion caught up with them, and Mara and Calder headed home with Margaret, who'd agreed to stay for a few days to finalize the legal paperwork. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, each of them processing what had happened. They'd won, not just the trial, but something larger. They'd proven that frontier people could stand up to corrupt systems, that courage and community mattered more than money and legal manipulation, that justice, however rare, was still possible. As they crested the hill that gave view to their property, Mara looked at the burned barn ruins and the house beyond, still standing, still home. "We need to rebuild," she said. "We will," Calder promised. "Together." And in that moment, Mara knew with absolute certainty that they would do exactly that. They'd survived Raymond's attacks, won an impossible trial, and forged a marriage from the ashes of a transaction. Rebuilding a barn would be easy compared to what they'd already accomplished. The hard part was over. Now came the part they'd been fighting for all along, the chance to actually live. The morning after the trial, Mara woke to find Calder already gone from their bed. She dressed quickly and found him outside, standing where the barn had been, staring at the blackened timbers and ash, as if planning how to resurrect something from nothing. "We start today," he said when she approached. "No point waiting." Margaret said the paperwork would take at least a week to finalize. "The legal stuff can wait. The barn can't. Winter's coming hard, and we need shelter for the animals we're going to buy back." He turned to her, and the determination in his face was beautiful. "I spent 20 years barely surviving. I'm done with that. Time to actually build something that lasts." They started clearing the debris that same morning. Henderson arrived with James and a wagon, having anticipated they'd need help. By afternoon, the Matsons appeared with tools and lumber they'd been storing. Word spread quickly, and within 2 days, nearly every family that had stood with them during the trial showed up to help rebuild. What emerged wasn't just a barn raising, it was a celebration of survival. Men hauled timber and hammered beams, while women prepared food and organized supplies. Children ran between the workers, playing games and getting underfoot in the way that made the work feel less like labor and more like life. Mara worked alongside everyone else, her hands blistering from unfamiliar tools, her muscles aching in new ways. But the pain felt good, earned, productive, the opposite of the helpless suffering she'd watched Calder endure. "You're getting the hang of it," Ellen Matson said, watching Mara hammer a nail with increasing confidence. "Give it a few more weeks and you'll be outworking the men." "I doubt that," Mara laughed, shaking out her sore hand. "But I'm learning that I'm stronger than I thought. That's what frontier life teaches you. Strength you didn't know you had." Ellen rested a hand on her pregnant belly. "Though I'll admit, I'm ready for this particular frontier challenge to be over. Baby's due in 3 weeks, and I'm tired of feeling like a wagon." "You look beautiful," Mara said honestly. "Exhausted, but beautiful." Spoken like someone who hasn't been pregnant yet. Ellen's eyes sparkled with mischief. "Give it time. You and Calder seem to be figuring things out pretty well." Heat rose to Mara's face. It was true. Their relationship had shifted from partnership to something deeper. They shared a bed now, shared their lives in ways that went far beyond legal obligation. But the idea of pregnancy, of bringing a child into their still uncertain world, felt too large to contemplate. "One crisis at a time," Mara said lightly. The barn took shape over the next 2 weeks. It was smaller than the original but sturdier, built with the kind of care that came from community investment. Every nail driven was a statement. We're here, we're staying, and we're not going anywhere. Margaret finalized the legal paperwork during that time, negotiating terms with the bank that were actually manageable. The debt was restructured based on the property's current value, with payment stretched over 10 years at reasonable interest. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was survivable. The bank's nervous about bad publicity, Margaret explained as they signed the new documents. Word's gotten around about what Raymond tried to do. They don't want to be seen as enabling that kind of predatory lending, so they're being surprisingly reasonable. How reasonable? Calder asked. Reasonable enough that if you have 1 or 2 good harvest seasons, you'll be ahead of schedule. Margaret smiled. You're going to make it, both of you. Raymond, meanwhile, had left town entirely. Rumors circulated. Some said he'd gone back east, others claimed he'd moved south to try his schemes in different territory. Either way, his departure felt like the final chapter of a nightmare finally ending. Mara's father had died during the trial week. She learned about it secondhand through a brief note from a neighbor. He'd drunk himself unconscious and simply never woken up. The news should have hurt more than it did. Instead, Mara felt only a distant sadness for the man he'd been before alcohol and weakness had consumed him, and relief that he'd finally found peace. She didn't attend the funeral. That part of her life was over, buried as thoroughly as her father would be. She had a new life now, one she'd chosen rather than inherited. The barn was completed on a Thursday, just as the first major snow of the season began to fall. They held an impromptu celebration that night, everyone crowding into the new structure that still smelled of fresh wood and possibility. Someone had brought whiskey, someone else had a harmonica, and the evening dissolved into music and laughter and the kind of joy that came from accomplishing something together. Calder stood with his arm around Mara, watching their neighbors dance and celebrate. His hearing had continued to improve, and though he'd never fully recover what had been lost, he could now follow conversations without straining, could hear music clearly enough to appreciate its beauty. "Thank you," he said quietly, "just for her." "For what?" "You built this barn." "For making me believe I deserved to build it. For saving my life and then teaching me how to live it." He kissed her temple. "For being stubborn enough not to give up on me when everyone else had." Mara leaned into him, feeling the solid warmth of his body against hers. "We saved each other. That's how this works." "Is it?" "It is now." Winter settled in hard after that, isolating them in the way frontier winters did. But isolation with Calder felt different from the loneliness Mara had known before. They spent long evenings by the fire, reading aloud from the books on the shelf, talking about everything and nothing, planning for spring. "We should expand the cattle operation," Calder said one night, sketching plans on scrap paper. "Maybe get some sheep, too. Diversify. We'd need more grazing land." Henderson mentioned he might sell the eastern section of his property, says he's getting too old to manage it all. Calder looked up. "What do you think?" The fact that he was asking, genuinely asking, treating her as an equal partner in decisions, still sometimes surprised her, but it was becoming normal, this collaboration, this marriage of equals. "I think if we're going to expand, we should do it smart. Start small, prove we can handle it, then grow." Mara moved to look at his sketches. "But yes, I think it's a good idea." They made love that night with the fire crackling and snow falling outside. And for the first time in her life, Mara understood what it meant to be truly intimate with another person, not just physically, but emotionally. Soul-deep connection that came from shared struggle and mutual choice. Afterwards, lying in the darkness with Calder's heartbeat steady beneath her ear, she felt something shift inside her, a certainty she hadn't expected. "I'm pregnant," she said. Calder went very still. "Are you sure?" "Not completely, but I think so. I'm late. And I feel different." She raised her head to look at him. "Are you scared?" "Terrified." He pulled her closer. "And happy. More happy than I knew was possible." "Me too." They told no one for weeks, waiting to be certain, but Mara's body confirmed what she'd suspected. By the time Ellen Matson gave birth to a healthy baby girl in late December, Mara was 2 months along and beginning to show. The news spread through their community like wildfire. Congratulations arrived with every visitor, along with advice, hand-me-down baby clothes, and the kind of communal excitement that made the pregnancy feel less like a private matter and more like a shared celebration. "First baby born from that miracle marriage," Henderson said, grinning broadly. "This kid's going to have quite a story to tell someday." If we tell them, Mara said, might be nice to just let them grow up normal. Nothing normal about frontier life, Ellen said, nursing her newborn daughter. But that's what makes it worth living. Your child's going to grow up knowing their parents fought for them before they were even born. That's a gift. Spring arrived with the kind of brutal beauty that defined the frontier, melting snow revealing green grass, birds returning, the world shaking off winter's grip. Mara's belly grew as the land thawed, her body changing in ways that were both uncomfortable and miraculous. Calder became almost comically protective, insisting she not lift anything heavy, work too hard, or take any risks. Mara found it endearing and exasperating in equal measure. I'm pregnant, not dying, she protested when he tried to prevent her from mucking out stalls. You're carrying our child. That's more important than any chore. The chores still need doing. Then I'll do them. You rest. They compromised. Mara took on lighter tasks while Calder handled the heavy labor, but she refused to be treated like fragile crystal. She'd fought too hard for her independence to surrender it now. In April, Dr. Holloway arrived with news that changed everything. The medical journal published my case study, he said, practically vibrating with excitement. And it's caused quite a stir. Other doctors are reporting similar cases now, chronic pain patients who were found to have parasites or other treatable physical causes that had been overlooked. Your case, Mrs. Voss, has literally changed how frontier medicine approaches diagnosis. I don't know what to say. Say you'll let me document your pregnancy and childbirth. I want to track maternal outcomes on the frontier, show that women like you, intelligent, capable women, can manage their own health with proper support and information. Holloway's eyes gleamed with professional passion. You've already revolutionized one field. Help me improve another. Mara looked at Calder, who shrugged. Your choice. Your body. All right, she said slowly. But on my terms. I'm not a specimen to be studied. I'm a person who happens to be pregnant. Understood completely. Holloway shook her hand with genuine respect. Thank you, Mrs. Voss. You're advancing medicine in ways you don't even realize. The pregnancy progressed normally, if uncomfortably. Mara dealt with morning sickness, back pain, swollen ankles, and the peculiar experience of feeling another life growing inside her. But underneath the physical challenges was a profound sense of purpose. She was creating something from nothing, the same way she and Calder had created their marriage, their home, their future. Summer brought prosperity. The cattle fattened on good grass. The garden Mara had planted flourished. They bought Henderson's eastern section and expanded their operation exactly as they'd planned. Money was still tight, but they were ahead of their debt payments for the first time ever. And through it all, Mara's belly grew larger, more present, impossible to ignore. Have you thought about names? Ellen asked during one of her visits. She'd become Mara's closest friend, the kind of relationship that formed quickly when two women shared the intimate details of pregnancy and motherhood. Some. Though Calder and I can't agree. He wants something traditional. I want something that means something. They can be both. Ellen shifted her own daughter to her other shoulder. We named this one Grace because she was a Grace, an unexpected gift after we thought we couldn't have any more children. The name means something, and it's traditional. Mara considered that. I'll think about it. August arrived with oppressive heat. Mara, now 8 months pregnant and miserable, spent most of her time in the shade, too uncomfortable to do much beyond basic tasks. Calder hovered constantly, bringing her water, fanning her, treating her like she might shatter. I love you, she said one particularly sweltering afternoon. But if you ask me one more time if I need anything, I might scream. He grinned, unrepentant. You're carrying my child in 100-degree heat. I'm allowed to worry. Worry quietly, from a distance. But she didn't mean it, and he knew it. His attentiveness, however overbearing, came from love, from the profound gratitude of a man who'd been given a second chance at life and refused to waste it. Labor started on a Tuesday in late August, 3 weeks before Dr. Holloway had predicted. Mara woke before dawn with cramping that felt different from the usual pregnancy discomfort. By the time Calder woke, the contractions were regular and increasing in intensity. It's time, she said, trying to keep the fear from her voice. Calder went pale. Now? Already? But the doctor said, babies don't follow schedules. Another contraction gripped her, and she breathed through it the way Ellen had taught her. Get Ellen, and Holloway if you can, but Ellen first. He ran, actually ran, leaving Mara alone in the house as dawn broke. She walked the floor, using movement to manage the pain, and tried not to think about all the things that could go wrong. Childbirth was dangerous on the frontier. Women died. Babies died. It was simply a fact of life. But Mara refused to be a statistic. She'd survived too much to die now. Ellen arrived within an hour, moving with the confidence of someone who'd given birth 4 times and helped deliver a dozen more babies. She took one look at Mara and nodded. You're doing fine. This is normal. Painful, but normal. She helped Mara to the bed. How far apart are the contractions? 5 minutes, maybe less. Good. That's good. We're making progress. Ellen checked her with practiced efficiency. You're about halfway there. The hard part's still coming, but you're strong. You can do this. Dr. Holloway arrived an hour later, bag in hand. He examined Mara with professional detachment, then nodded to Ellen. She's progressing well. Everything looks normal. I'll stay in case complications arise, but it seems you ladies have this well in hand. Where's Calder? Mara gasped between contractions. Pacing outside like a caged animal, Ellen said with amusement. Want me to bring him in? No, he'll just be anxious. Tell him. Another contraction hit, stronger than before, and Mara lost her train of thought. The labor lasted 14 hours. 14 hours of pain that eclipsed anything Mara had experienced before. She understood now why women died in childbirth, not from medical complications, but from sheer exhaustion. The body could only endure so much, but she endured. Ellen coached her through each contraction. Holloway monitored her progress. And outside, Calder wore a path in the dirt, refusing to leave even when Henderson tried to take him for a drink. Finally, as the sun began to set, Ellen said the words Mara had been desperate to hear. It's time to push. What followed was primal and terrifying and strangely empowering. Mara pushed with everything she had, feeling her body do what it was designed to do, creating life through sheer force of will and biology. And then, as the last light of day faded, a baby's cry split the air. It's a girl, Holloway announced, his voice thick with emotion. A healthy baby girl. Ellen placed the screaming, bloody, perfect infant on Mara's chest. Mara stared down at her daughter, hers and Calder's, and felt something fundamental shift in the universe. This tiny person, barely minutes old, was already the center of everything. Someone get Calder, she whispered. He burst into the room seconds later, his face streaked with tears he hadn't bothered to hide. He crossed to the bed and stared at his daughter with the same expression of wonder Mara felt. We did it, Mara said. We made a person. You did it. Calder's hand shook as he gently touched the baby's head. You're incredible, both of you. What should we name her? Mara asked. They'd discussed it endlessly but never settled on anything definitive. Now, looking at their daughter's face, the answer seemed obvious. Hope, Calder said. We should name her Hope, because that's what you gave me, what she represents. Mara nodded, too exhausted and emotional to speak. Hope. It was perfect, simple, and powerful, and true. Hope Voss. Born from a marriage that started as a transaction and became something unbreakable. Born to parents who'd fought against impossible odds and won. Born into a community that had rallied around them when the world tried to tear them apart. Dr. Holloway documented everything, the birth weight, the timing, Mara's recovery. He'd write another paper, Mara knew. More advancement of frontier medicine built on her willingness to be observed and recorded. But she didn't mind. If her story could help other women, other families, then the invasion of privacy was worth it. Ellen stayed for 3 days, helping Mara navigate the exhausting world of newborn care. Breastfeeding, diaper changes, the constant cycle of sleeping and waking. Calder helped with everything, treating each task as sacred rather than beneath him. My mother told me that fathers who refuse to help with babies are just cowards dressed up as tradition, he said one night while changing Hope's diaper. I'm not going to be a coward. Not about this. Neighbors visited throughout the following weeks, bringing food and gifts and congratulations. The same community that had stood with them during the trial now celebrated Hope's arrival with genuine joy. This baby wasn't just theirs. She belonged to everyone who'd fought for her parents' right to exist freely. Henderson brought a hand-carved cradle. The Matsons brought tiny clothes sewn by Ellen. Even families Mara barely knew sent gifts, a quilt, a silver spoon, a blessing carved in wood. "You've become important to people," Margaret Chen said during her visit. She'd traveled from the county seat specifically to meet Hope. "Not just as individuals, but as symbols. You proved that ordinary people can fight corrupt systems and win, that frontier women are just as capable as men, that love and community matter more than money." "We're not symbols," Mara protested. "We're just people trying to survive." "All symbols are just people at first." Margaret held Hope with surprising gentleness for someone so fierce. "But what you've done, standing up to Raymond, winning that trial, building a life together, it's changed how people think, especially women. You've shown them they don't have to accept whatever men decide for them." "Is that why you do what you do? Defend people like us?" "I do it because I was once a woman with no options, came to this country with nothing, faced down prejudice and barriers at every turn. But I fought, and I won, and now I help others fight." She handed Hope back to Mara. "You're part of that fight, whether you intended to be or not. Own it. Use it to make things better for the next generation." Autumn arrived with crisp air and changing leaves. Hope grew from a tiny newborn into a more robust infant with her father's gray eyes and her mother's determined expression. Mara healed from childbirth and slowly returned to ranch work, carrying Hope in a sling Ellen had taught her to fashion. The harvest was good that year. They sold cattle at premium prices. The debt payments came easily, with money left over to save. For the first time since marrying, Mara and Calder could breathe without the constant pressure of financial ruin hanging over them. "We're going to make it," Calder said one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset with Hope asleep between them. "Actually make it. Not just survive, but thrive." "We already are," Mara corrected. "We have each other. We have our daughter. We have friends who'd stand with us against anything. That's not just survival. That's living." "You're right." He took her hand. "I spent so many years just existing, counting down days until the pain would finally kill me. And now look at us. A family. A home. A future. All because you refused to let me give up." "We refused," Mara said. "Together. That's the only way this works." In October, Dr. Holloway returned with news that his paper on Hope's birth had been published and well received. More importantly, the original case study about Calder's parasite had led to 3 other diagnoses across the territory. 3 more people suffering needlessly who were now being treated. "You've saved lives, Mrs. Voss," Holloway said seriously. "Not just your husbands, but strangers you'll never meet. People who will live full lives because doctors now know to look for what you found." "Good," Mara said simply. "Then it was all worth it." News arrived in November that Raymond had died in a gambling dispute somewhere in Texas, stabbed over a card game, according to the report. Mara felt nothing hearing it, not satisfaction, not grief, just a distant acknowledgement that a chapter had truly closed. Her father's house had been seized by creditors and sold. Everything she'd grown up with was gone, dispersed to strangers or lost to time. But Mara found she didn't mourn it, that life had never really been hers. This one was. Winter returned, completing the cycle. They gathered around the fire as snow fell outside, Calder, Mara, and Hope, who was now 4 months old and starting to laugh at everything. The ranch was secure, the debt was manageable. The future, for the first time in either of their lives, looked genuinely hopeful. "Tell me about your dreams now," Calder said one night. "Not the ones you had before everything changed, the ones you have now." Mara considered the question while Hope nursed contentedly. "I dream about Hope growing up strong and free, about teaching her to read and think and question, about her having choices we never had." "What else?" "I dream about expanding the ranch, about being so successful that we can help others the way our neighbors helped us, about maybe teaching someday, not in a formal school, but here, teaching frontier children who don't have access to education." She looked at him. "What about you?" I dream about growing old with you, about watching our daughters maybe, or sons, build their own lives, about never taking a single pain-free day for granted. He kissed her forehead. Simple dreams. But after years of just dreaming about the pain ending, simple feels like everything. The year turned to winter, and then to spring again. Hope learned to sit up, then crawl, then pull herself standing on furniture. The ranch prospered. They paid down debt faster than anticipated and even bought more land from Henderson, who decided to retire and move closer to town. Dr. Holloway continued visiting regularly, documenting Hope's development and Mara's theories about child rearing and frontier medicine. Margaret Chen wrote letters updating them on legal reforms she was pushing, reforms inspired partly by their case, designed to protect women's rights and limit predatory lending practices. They'd become part of something larger than themselves without quite meaning to. Their story spread through the territory, then beyond it. The woman who'd saved her husband against all medical wisdom. The couple who'd stood up to corruption and won. The marriage that proved transactions could become true partnership. People wrote them letters, women mostly, asking for advice about medical problems doctors had dismissed, about abusive situations they didn't know how to escape, about dreams they'd been told were impossible. Mara answered every letter she could, offering what wisdom she'd learned. Trust your instincts, fight for yourself, find your community, refuse to be dismissed. On Hope's first birthday, they threw a celebration that drew nearly 100 people. The entire community came to honor not just the child, but what she represented, the future they'd all fought to protect. There was music and food and laughter and dancing. Henderson played fiddle while couples whirled across the cleared yard. Children ran wild in the way children should, free and joyful and safe. Calder held Hope while Mara danced with James Henderson, then with Robert Matson, then with Calder himself while Ellen held the baby. The evening dissolved into the kind of perfect memory that would sustain them through harder times. Because hard times would come again, they always did. But Mara and Calder had learned the secret. Hard times were survivable when you faced them together. When you had community behind you, when you refused to surrender to fear or despair, or the men who weaponized both. As the celebration wound down and guests began departing, Mara stood with Calder watching the last of the sunset paint the sky gold and crimson. Hope drowsed against her father's shoulder, worn out from being passed around and adored all day. "Do you ever think about how different things could have been?" Calder asked. "If you'd refused the marriage, if I hadn't reached out to Raymond, if any of a dozen choices had gone differently." "Sometimes, but I try not to dwell on it." Mara leaned against him. "We could play what if forever. What if that parasite had killed you before I arrived? What if Raymond had succeeded in stealing the ranch? What if the jury had convicted me? But none of those things happened. This happened. We happened. Best thing that ever happened to me. To both of us." They stood there as darkness fell, three people who'd been strangers 2 years ago and were now family. The ranch stretched around them, land they'd fought for, bled for, almost lost but ultimately kept. The house behind them held memories of struggle and triumph. The new barn stood solid against the sky, built by community hands and community will. This was home, not because of the buildings or the land, but because of the people who'd made it so, who'd chosen to stand together when standing alone would have meant falling, who'd decided that love was worth fighting for, that justice was worth pursuing, that courage was contagious and could change everything. Mara had been sold for $50, had been nothing but a transaction, a burden, a problem to be solved. But she'd transformed that transaction into partnership, that burden into strength, that problem into possibility. She'd saved a man's life by refusing to accept that his suffering was inevitable. She'd saved her own life by refusing to be owned. And together, they'd created something unbreakable. A family forged by choice rather than obligation, strengthened by adversity, and sustained by love that had grown from the ashes of a loveless arrangement. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of wood smoke and autumn grass. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called. Stars began appearing in the darkening sky, one by one, marking the transition from day to night. "Time to go in," Calder said softly. "Put this little one to bed." They walked back to the house together, Calder carrying Hope while Mara held the lamp to light their way. Behind them, the barn stood solid. The land stretched quiet. The future waited with infinite possibility. And inside the house that had once been nothing but a place to survive, Mara and Calder Voss built their life, raised their daughter, and proved that sometimes the best stories start with the worst circumstances. That redemption was possible, that transformation was real, that love, however unlikely its origins, could become the foundation on which entire futures were built. The transaction had ended years ago. What remained was something far more valuable, a marriage that was truly chosen, a family that was truly wanted, and a legacy that would echo through generations. They'd fought for their right to exist on their own terms. They'd won. And in winning, they'd given hope, and every child who came after, a world where courage mattered more than compliance, where community protected its own, and where women like Mara Voss could save lives without asking permission. The door closed behind them, shutting out the cold. Inside, warmth and light and family waited. And that was everything.